He was invisible. He was supposed to stay that way. But when a $300 million deal began to collapse, and 20 elite interpreters sat frozen in silence, the man nobody noticed pushed open the boardroom door and changed everything. If you've ever been underestimated, overlooked, or written off before you even got a chance to speak, this story is for you. Stay until the end, because what happens in that boardroom is something none of those executives will ever forget. Hit that like button right now, drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story travels. The first sign that the day was going to go badly was the coffee. Vanessa Hale noticed it at 7:14 in the morning when her assistant Marcus set a cup on her desk and the lid wasn't sealed properly. Dark roast bled onto a stack of preliminary contracts she'd been reviewing since 5 a.m., bleeding through the top 3 pages before she caught it. She blotted the papers with a napkin, saw the ink had smeared on the signature lines, and felt something tighten in her chest that had nothing to do with the coffee. It was a small thing. She knew it was a small thing. But Vanessa Hale had not gotten to where she was by ignoring small things. She was 30 years old, youngest CEO in Blackstone Dynamics' 42-year history, the kind of fact that got written up in business magazines with her photo beside it, usually a shot where she looked slightly more composed than she actually felt. The company had been her father's before it was hers, handed over 18 months ago when a heart condition pulled him out of the executive seat faster than anyone expected. And she'd spent every one of those 18 months trying to prove that the handover wasn't nepotism, wasn't a favor, wasn't a soft landing for a daughter who didn't earn it. The $300 million deal with the Meridian Group was supposed to be the proof. Meridian was a European conglomerate, technically headquartered in Geneva, but operating across 11 countries with subsidiary divisions that touched everything from logistics infrastructure to pharmaceutical supply chains. They were old money and new power, the kind of organization that had been around long enough to develop its own internal culture, its own negotiating language, its own way of testing the people across the table before committing to anything serious. Getting Meridian to the table had taken Vanessa 8 months. 8 months of calls, presentations, modified proposals, travel, and one genuinely awful dinner in Brussels where she'd smiled through 4 hours of conversation with executives who clearly weren't sure a 30-year-old woman was the right person to be leading this deal. She'd gotten them to the table anyway. Today was the day the contract was supposed to be finalized. At 7:45, she stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of her corner office on the 32nd floor and looked out over the city the way she always did when she needed to think. The skyline was gray this morning, low clouds pressing down, the kind that made everything feel slightly compressed, slightly urgent. She liked it better on clear days when the light was sharp and the city looked like it had answers. Today, it just looked like weather. Her phone buzzed. Marcus again. Delegation confirmed. 12 executives. They've brought their own legal team, 4 people, and they've added 3 more to the group since last week. She typed back, "How many is that total?" 15 on their side. She stared at the number. Last week it had been 12. 3 additional people showing up unannounced to a contract finalization meeting wasn't a logistical issue. It was a signal. 15 people for a signing ceremony was overkill. 15 people meant they were planning to negotiate. She typed, "Get me Davies." Gerald Davies was her head of legal, a 56-year-old man who had the energy of someone perpetually disappointed in the world, but the competence to back up the attitude. He was in her office in 4 minutes, which meant he'd already been on his way. "You saw the head count," she said. It wasn't a question. "I saw it." He dropped into the chair across from her desk without being invited, which was one of the things she'd learned to allow. 3 additional members of their team. I've been running background on who they added. 2 are attorneys, contract specialists. The third one is interesting. Tell me the interesting one. His name is Claude Renard. He's listed as a senior consultant, but his actual background is in deal restructuring. Specifically, he's been involved in 3 acquisitions in the last 4 years, where the acquiring party came out significantly better than the initial term sheet suggested they would. Vanessa picked up her pen, set it back down. He renegotiates mid-process. He renegotiates mid-process, Davies confirmed. Quietly, without anyone realizing the terms have shifted until it's too late to unwind. She was quiet for a moment. What do we need? Sharper translation. Our current interpreter arrangement was built around standard multilingual support, French, German, Spanish, Italian, for their primary communication. But Renard's technique, based on what I've read, involves using casual conversation to embed contract language. Different registers, different dialects, sometimes slang that doesn't translate cleanly through a standard corporate interpreter. So get better interpreters. I already called the agency. He hesitated just slightly. I've arranged for 20. She looked at him. 20 interpreters, he said again, covering a combined range of 15 languages, including regional variants. It's more than we've ever deployed for a single session, but given what I think Renard is going to try, do it, she said, whatever it costs. That had been 2 hours ago. Right, now it was 10 a.m., and the Meridian Group's delegation was in the lobby. Vanessa watched them come off the elevator on the security feed she'd pulled up on her desk monitor. 15 people in dark suits, arranged with the unconscious precision of people who did this kind of thing regularly. They moved through the lobby in a loose cluster, heads slightly bent toward each other, already talking, already working. Claude Renard was easy to pick out. He was around 60, with silver hair kept short and a face that didn't give away much. He walked slightly behind the main group, which meant either he was deferring to the senior executives or he was watching them, watching how they moved, what they said, which one of Blackstone's people made eye contact too eagerly. Vanessa had met people like Renard before. They collected information the way other people collected nothing, because they never stopped, because everything was data, because the meeting started the moment you walked into the building and anyone who thought it started when you sat down at the table was already behind. She straightened her jacket, checked the time, picked up the coffee cup with the bad lid and dropped it in the trash. The main conference room on the 32nd floor was the biggest space in the building, a long rectangular room with a table that sat 30 floor-to-ceiling windows on one wall and a presentation screen that took up most of the opposite wall. By 9:30, it had been set up with water, notepads, and the kind of careful, neutral decor that was meant to say serious but not aggressive. The 20 interpreters were arranged along the side wall, each with a headset and a small monitor. They were professionals. Vanessa could see that immediately. Good posture, quiet confidence, the practiced stillness of people who'd done this in rooms with much higher stakes than a conference room in the financial district. Several of them had worked for government agencies. One had done UN translation work. She'd been told the panel covered French, German, Spanish, Italian, Arabic, Japanese, Russian, and Mandarin, as well as a handful of regional variants. It was the best language support she could have assembled on short notice. She was going to need every single one of them. The delegation came in at 10:07. There was a round of handshakes, names exchanged, the brief uncomfortable shuffle of 15 people and 20 interpreters and 8 Blackstone executives all finding their places around a table that suddenly felt smaller than it had 20 minutes ago. Vanessa took the head of the table. Across from her, the lead Meridian executive sat a German man named Heinrich Braun, around 55, broad through the shoulders, with a specific kind of confidence that comes from spending 30 years being right about things, settled into his chair and nodded at her. "Ms. Hale," he said in clean English, "thank you for the arrangement." "Mr. Braun," she said, "we're glad you're here. Let's get to work." For the first 40 minutes, it was almost routine. They moved through the preliminary sections, the delivery timelines, the liability clauses, the standard indemnification language that both legal teams had already reviewed 12 times in the weeks leading up to today. The interpreters worked quietly. The Meridian attorneys asked a few questions in German and French. The Blackstone team answered. Davies occasionally leaned over and murmured something to Vanessa, pointing at specific passages in the contract binder in front of her. Renard sat 3 chairs down from Braun and said almost nothing. He was watching the interpreters. Vanessa noticed that, and the noticing settled something cold in her stomach. At 10:53, the dynamic shifted. It started small. One of the Meridian attorneys, a younger man, maybe 35, with a slight accent that Vanessa couldn't immediately place, said something to the man beside him, not loudly, not formally. Just a quick comment, the kind you make in a meeting when you're referring to something in the documents in front of you. The head interpreter, a woman named Dr. Patricia Chen, who had 20 years in international finance, translated it as a question about delivery buffer periods. Renard wrote something on his notepad. Braun nodded and moved the conversation forward. 20 minutes later, a similar exchange happened on the other side of the table. Two Meridian executives speaking quietly in what sounded like Spanish. But the specific regional cadence was off, slightly. The assigned Spanish interpreter translated it as a comment about force majeure conditions. Davies circled something in his binder and passed it to Vanessa, with a question mark written beside the margin note. She looked at it. The force majeure language in front of her was standard. There was nothing obviously wrong with it, but Davies' instinct for wrong things was one of the reasons she paid him what she paid him. She wrote back, "Keep watching." By noon, the headache had arrived. It lived behind her left eye, the specific kind that came from sustained concentration in a room with recycled air and too many people. She'd had 2 more cups of coffee and drunk half a bottle of water, and none of it had helped. Across the table, the Meridian delegation looked fresh. Animated even, in the way that people look when things are going their way. The interpreters were starting to look strained. The problem wasn't volume, it was frequency and register. Meridian's team had stopped communicating formally and started communicating continuously. Side conversations, asides, casual remarks made while flipping through documents. Some of it was background noise, the kind of thing you filter out in any meeting, but some of it was clearly substantive, and the interpreters were struggling to determine which was which. They were trained for formal translation, structured dialogue, clear speaker attribution. This was something else. This was a room full of people talking at once in 6 different languages at 3 different registers, and the system was fraying. Dr. Chen, to her credit, was still managing, but she'd flagged twice in the last 15 minutes for clarification on phrases that had already passed, which meant she was running behind. Renard had noticed. Of course he had. He leaned over and said something quietly to Braun, and Braun made a small gesture, barely a nod, and the pace of the side conversations increased. Vanessa recognized what she was watching. They were turning up the heat to see what cracked. At 12:47, a break was called. 40 minutes of sandwiches and coffee, and the kind of strained, polite conversation that happens when 2 sides of a negotiation are both pretending things are going better than they are. Vanessa pulled Davies and 2 of the senior interpreters into a side room. "Tell me what you're getting," she said, without softening it. Dr. Chen pressed her lips together. "The primary track is clean. The formal language, the structured negotiation, we're covering it. But the peripheral conversation is—" She paused. "There's a dialect issue. Some of the secondary speakers are using a variant of regional French that isn't standard. Walloon influence, possibly. Belgian French with some specific local markers that I'm not fully capturing. And the others?" The second interpreter, a man who'd introduced himself as Stefan, was covering German. "Similar issue. The German isn't Hochdeutsch. It's got Austrian markers, maybe Viennese business dialect. I'm getting most of it, but some of the technical phrasing is slipping." "Slipping how much?" Neither of them answered immediately, which was itself an answer. Davies said quietly, "They're not translating noise. They're translating language that's structured to look like noise, and some of it isn't noise." Vanessa looked at him. "The force majeure comment from this morning," he said. "I've been sitting with it. If the translation was slightly off, if the actual meaning was something like in the event of regulatory non-compliance rather than in the event of unforeseen circumstances, then the clause it maps to in Section 14 has a completely different implication for our liability exposure." The cold thing in her stomach from earlier was back, and bigger. How much exposure? If I'm wrong, nothing. If I'm right, he opened his binder to a dog-eared page. Somewhere between $60 and $90 million in risk transfer. To us. The room was quiet for a moment. "We have to get through the afternoon session," Vanessa said. "With what?" Dr. Chen asked. Not challenging, genuinely asking. Vanessa didn't have an answer. Not yet. On the 31st floor, which was technically part of Blackstone's footprint, but operated more like an auxiliary space. Overflow storage, printer stations, a break room that smelled permanently of someone's decade-old coffee spill. A man named Ethan Walker was navigating a cleaning cart around a paper jam outside the copier room. The cart was the industrial kind, with 4 compartments and a trash bag loop that always seemed to be on the wrong side. Ethan had been using it for 11 months, long enough that he knew its tendencies. The left wheel that caught on carpet edges, the spray bottle that leaked if you didn't keep it upright. He kept a folded piece of cardboard under the spray bottle for exactly that reason. Small adjustments. The job had a lot of small adjustments. He was 32, though he looked older when he was tired, which was most days. Medium height, medium build, with hands that had seen different kinds of work than the current job suggested. There were calluses in places that pushing a cart didn't explain, a mechanical familiarity with physical labor that went beyond office cleaning. His hair needed a cut. It always needed a cut. He kept meaning to get to it on a weekend, but weekends were for Lily, and Lily's time didn't get traded for haircuts. Lily was 6. She had a gap where her 2 front teeth were working on coming in, and an opinion about everything, and a habit of falling asleep mid-sentence when she was tired, which Ethan found both exhausting and quietly devastating in the way that small, beautiful things can be devastating when you're the only one watching them. He'd been a single father for 3 years, not by design, not by anything he'd chosen. He didn't think about it in those terms anymore, or at least he tried not to. The story of how he'd gotten here had a way of pulling him backward if he let it, and pulling backward wasn't something he had the energy for on days when there were paper jams to deal with, and floors to mop, and a daughter to pick up from after school at 5:30 sharp. He cleared the paper jam, checked the output tray, straightened the stack that had accumulated during the malfunction, and moved the cart toward the supply closet to reload on trash bags. From above him, the 32nd floor, he could hear the faint sound of the conference room. Not voices, just the particular weight of a large group of people in a room, the kind of collective presence that vibrates faintly through a building if you're quiet enough, and the building is old enough to carry sound that way. He'd worked late nights in here often enough to know which rooms held meetings that ran long, which ones had the kind of tension that made people forget they'd been sitting for 3 hours. He wasn't thinking about what was happening up there. He was thinking about whether Lily's school bag needed new Velcro tabs, because he'd noticed yesterday morning that one of them was pulling loose. The afternoon session started at 2 p.m. By 2:30, it was clear that whatever they'd hoped to reset during the break hadn't reset. The Meridian team came back looser, more relaxed in the way that predators get relaxed when they've decided the situation is under control. Renard had moved from his chair 3 spots down to the seat directly to Braun's left, which meant he was now at the center of things rather than the edge. He was talking more, not to the Blackstone team, to his own people, in a low, continuous murmur that kept the interpreters' heads turning in his direction, and then back to the main conversation, and then back to him again. Dr. Chen flagged something at 2:38. Ms. Hale. Her voice was quiet, controlled, but there was something underneath it. I need to note that I'm capturing approximately 70% of the peripheral exchange. Some of what I'm missing may be relevant. 30% missing. In a room where hidden clauses could be embedded in casual conversation, 30% missing was the same as 30% gone. At 2:45, one of the Meridian attorneys spoke directly to Vanessa in French, the formal kind, textbook clean, and asked a question about the payment waterfall structure in Section 8. Dr. Chen translated it accurately. Vanessa answered, Davies elaborating with specifics. But while that exchange was happening, Renard said something to the man on his right. It was brief, maybe 8 words. His tone was the tone of a man confirming something, not asking, confirming. And the man nodded once, made a note, and then went back to his documents. Stefan leaned toward his microphone. Partial capture. I'm not confident in the translation. Nobody at the main table reacted. Nobody had heard the uncertainty except Vanessa through the earpiece she was wearing. She kept her expression still. At 3:15, things started to unravel. The session had moved to the penalty clause section, the language governing what happened if either party failed to meet the terms of the agreement, including late delivery, regulatory non-compliance, and what the contract called extraordinary operational disruptions. This was Section 14, the section Davies had flagged that morning with his force majeure concern. The Meridian lead attorney opened with a question that seemed routine, a clarification on the definition of extraordinary operational disruptions, specifically whether it covered government-mandated shutdowns. Davies answered, It did, within certain defined parameters. The attorney nodded, made a note, said something to the person beside him in what sounded like Italian, quick and quiet. The Italian interpreter, a young man from the agency, good at his job in formal settings, rendered it as a comment about the adequacy of the definition. But then Renard spoke. 4 sentences in what Vanessa's earpiece identified as French, but not the French from earlier. The words were slower, more deliberate, and the interpreter's voice in her ear went quiet for a moment longer than it should have before attempting something about regional statutory compliance obligations. The phrasing is, I'm not certain of the modifier he used. The root word suggests restriction, but the qualifier. Vanessa looked at Dr. Chen. Chen's face was carefully controlled, but her pen had stopped moving. Davies had gone very still. Renard continued, and as he continued, 2 other Meridian executives entered the conversation. One in German with an Austrian inflection, one in what Stefan had identified earlier as possibly regional Flemish, and the interpreters were splitting their attention across 3 simultaneous speakers, 3 registers, 3 language variants, all converging on a section of the contract that Vanessa now understood was not being discussed casually. This was deliberate, this was coordinated, and it was working. What? At 3:41, Ethan Walker was on the 32nd floor. He wasn't supposed to be. Not technically. The 32nd floor cleaning schedule was built around off hours, 9 p.m. to midnight, because of the conference room and the executive suite. But one of the other night staff had called out sick this week, and the day supervisor had redistributed the supply runs, restocking paper towel dispensers and replacing trash bags in the server closets to fill the gap. Ethan had taken the extra slot because extra slots meant extra hours, and extra hours were not something he turned down. He moved quietly. That was habit, not instruction. 11 months of this work had made him quiet the way water makes stone smooth, not through effort, but through repetition. He kept the cart's wheels slow, took corners wide to avoid the scratch marks on the baseboards that the previous guy had left everywhere, and generally moved through occupied spaces the way you move through a room where someone is sleeping. The hallway outside the main conference room had a supply closet 60 feet from the entrance. He was heading for the closet. Through the conference room walls, good walls, solid walls, but not soundproof, not really, because nothing in a building this old was fully soundproof. He could hear voices. He wasn't paying attention to them. And then one of the voices said something in a specific regional dialect of French, and Ethan Walker's hand slowed on the cart. He stopped. He stood in the hallway and listened for about 15 seconds. And in those 15 seconds, the voice inside the room said 6 more sentences that he understood completely, and that the man on the other side of the door, the one in the conference room with the headset, clearly did not. Ethan's jaw tightened. He understood what he was hearing. He also understood what it meant for the people in that room who weren't hearing it. He stayed in the hallway another 30 seconds, listening. The German started up. Proper Austrian Viennese business dialect, the kind you got from men who'd spent their careers in certain specific sectors of the European financial industry, where the vocabulary had evolved into its own compressed shorthand over decades. Then, underneath it, Japanese. Osaka inflection, not formal boardroom Japanese, the casual, pragmatic kind used between people who'd known each other long enough to drop the careful register. He heard the word for penalty. He heard the word for transfer. He heard a phrase that, in the register being used, meant something quite different from what it would mean in a dictionary. Ethan Walker stood in the hallway of the 32nd floor of Blackstone Dynamics and looked at his cleaning cart for a long moment. Then he looked at the conference room door. He knocked. Just once. Quiet. The knock of someone who wasn't sure it was a good idea and hadn't talked himself out of it fast enough. The door opened. An assistant, young woman, clearly frazzled, clipboard in hand, looked at him with the specific expression people use when they open a door and find someone unexpected on the other side of it. "This is an active negotiation session," she said. "Cleaning services are—" "I know," Ethan said. "I need 1 minute with whoever is in charge." She stared at him, at his cart, at the Blackstone Dynamics maintenance badge on his chest. "Sir, I can't— 1 minute," he said. "I think it's important." He didn't push past her. He didn't raise his voice. He just stood there with his cart in the hallway and waited, and something in the way he stood, not aggressive, not apologetic, just very certain of something, made her hesitate. She stepped back inside. 30 seconds later, she returned. "You have 30 seconds," she said. "Don't touch anything." The conference room was bigger than it looked from the hallway. 20 people, maybe more, and everyone looking at him. The interpreters in their row along the side wall. The Blackstone executives, several of whom he recognized from the executive floor. And across the table, 15 men and women in suits who looked at him with the particular expression of people who had just watched something unexpected walk through a door. The woman at the head of the table saw. He knew who she was. Everyone in the building knew who Vanessa Hale was. You don't clean a building without knowing the person at the top of it. Looked at him with a face that was working hard to stay neutral. "Can I help you?" she said. Her tone was controlled, not unkind, but the subtext was clear. This is not a place you belong, and you have about 10 seconds to explain yourself before I have you removed. "My name is Ethan Walker," he said. "I work maintenance, 31st floor." He paused. "I was in the hallway outside this room about 10 minutes ago." One of the Meridian executives, the silver-haired one toward the middle of the table, shifted very slightly in his seat. "I think," Ethan said, "that some of what's being said in this room isn't being accurately translated." Silence. And then one of the Blackstone executives, older man, legal department probably, from the look of the binders stacked in front of him, said, "Sir, we have 20 professional interpreters in this room." "I know," Ethan said. "I could hear them from the hallway." Across the table, the silver-haired man was watching him with a very different expression than the one he'd had a moment ago. Still careful, but different. Vanessa said, "What specifically did you hear?" "The conversation about Section 14, Ethan said. "The penalty clause section. The man to your left, silver hair, third from the end, said something in regional Walloon French about statut de conformité restrictive. It was translated as a comment about compliance adequacy." He paused. "That's not what it means. In the context he used it, with the qualifier before the noun, it's a legal term of art from the Belgian Commercial Code. It means statutory restriction on liability transfer. If that maps to the clause they're building around, you speak French?" The question came from the man he'd just described, the silver-haired one, not alarmed exactly, but paying very close attention. "Some," Ethan said. "What other languages do you speak?" Vanessa asked. He looked at her. There was something in her expression now, not the removal in 10 seconds look, something else, something calculating. "Enough," he said, and the room went very quiet. Vanessa made a decision in about 4 seconds. It wasn't a careful decision. It wasn't a fully thought-through decision. It was the kind of decision you make when you've run the numbers fast and the alternative is worse. "Davies," she said without looking away from Ethan, "pull a chair up from the side." "Vanessa, a chair." Davies pulled a chair from against the wall and set it at the end of the Blackstone side of the table. Not a power seat, not a negotiator's position, just a chair at the edge of the setup. Ethan looked at it, and then at his cart in the hallway, and then back at Vanessa. "Someone can watch the cart," she said. He walked in. Across the table, the silver-haired man, Renard, though Ethan didn't know his name yet, looked at him for a long moment. Then he picked up his pen and wrote something on his notepad, and Ethan couldn't see what it was. But he could guess. Oh, they started again. The Meridian lead attorney asked a question in formal French. Dr. Chen translated it. Ethan didn't say anything. Then one of the secondary executives said something casual in the Walloon dialect to the man beside him. Dr. Chen started to translate, and Ethan said quietly, "That's not quite right." The room went very still. Vanessa said, "What did he say?" Ethan said, "He said that the délai de notification préalable, the advance notification window, should be read in the context of Article 17 of the Belgian Commercial Code, not the general contract definition. If you use the general definition, the notification period is 30 days. Under Article 17, it's 72 hours. Dr. Chen stared at him. Davies made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Across the table, three of the Meridian executives glanced at each other in a way that was very fast and very controlled, and would have meant nothing if Ethan hadn't been watching for it. "Where did you learn Walloon French?" Renard asked. "Belgium," Ethan said. "I worked the docks outside Liège for about 4 months. The men I worked with didn't use much standard French." Renard looked at him for a long moment. "What else did you hear?" Vanessa said. Ethan leaned forward slightly. "The German, about 20 minutes before the break." Austrian inflection, Viennese business dialect. There's a phrase in Austrian financial practice, Haftungsverschiebung im Steuerrecht, that has a specific meaning in tax liability allocation. It was translated as a general comment about operational burden. It's not. In context, it's an attempt to establish a precedent for shifting tax exposure to the counterparty in cross-border transactions. He glanced at Davies. "Does Section 22 have a tax liability allocation clause?" Davies was already opening his binder. His hands weren't entirely steady. "Page 87, he said. Subclause C. "Then that conversation needs to be reviewed in relation to that clause," Ethan said. "Because if they can argue that an oral agreement to interpret it in a certain way was established during this session, they can't," said the Meridian lead attorney in clean English. "Nothing said informally in this room constitutes a binding agreement." "No," Ethan agreed, "but it establishes an intention of understanding, which, under certain arbitration frameworks, can influence how a clause is applied in dispute." He looked at the attorney. "You know which frameworks I mean." The attorney said nothing. The room was very quiet. Vanessa looked at the maintenance badge on Ethan's chest, and then at his face, and then she picked up her pen. "Let's go back to Section 14, she said. They went back to Section 14, and this time, nothing slipped through. Every casual exchange, every side comment, every quick remark made in the assumption that it would land in a gap between formal translation passes, Ethan caught them. His French was dockworker French, rough at the edges and completely accurate about what mattered. His German was the German of mechanics and construction crews in Vienna and Munich, practical and unpretty. When one of the Meridian executives switched briefly into Italian, Milanese dialect, the kind used in northern Italian financial circles, Ethan translated it before the Italian interpreter finished parsing the opening phrase, and the look on the interpreter's face was something that nobody in the room entirely knew how to react to. Renard watched all of it. He was the kind of man who adapted quickly, and he was adapting now. The casual conversation channels had been closed. Ethan had made clear that nothing said in this room was going to pass unheard. So the technique was no longer viable. That left formal negotiation, where the terms were explicit and the playing field was more even, and where Blackstone's legal team was more than capable of holding their own. At 4:38, Renard said something in Japanese. Not to anyone in particular, a murmured comment, almost as if to himself. Every interpreter in the row turned their head. Ethan said, in a Japanese that was Osaka-inflected and very direct, "You said the foundation of this agreement is already compromised. I disagree. I think you're just frustrated that it stopped working the way you planned." The silence that followed was the loudest one yet. Braun turned and looked at Renard. Renard sat back in his chair and folded his hands on the table in front of him. And for the first time since he'd walked into the room, he smiled. It wasn't a warm smile, but it was genuine. The specific smile of a man who has just discovered something he hadn't expected. "You speak Kansai dialect," he said in English. "I spent some time in Osaka," Ethan said, "loading and unloading cargo." "Dock work." "Some dock work, some other things." Renard nodded slowly. "What exactly is your role here, Mr. Walker?" Before Ethan could answer, Vanessa said, "He's with us." By 5:15, the session had extended 90 minutes past schedule. The Meridian team had requested 2 short breaks, which Vanessa had granted, and the temperature in the room had shifted in a way that everyone present could feel, but that would have been difficult to describe precisely. The energy that Meridian had walked in with, that particular controlled confidence, the sense of a script being followed, had been replaced by something more careful, more genuine. The formal negotiation that had replaced the embedded language strategy was harder and more direct, and Davies and his team were good at hard and direct. At 5:40, they reached a section of the agreement where the Meridian attorney proposed a modification to the force majeure language, the specific clause that Davies had flagged that morning. The modification was structured carefully, and in written form it looked almost reasonable. But the additional qualifier the attorney wanted to add, a phrase borrowed, Ethan noted quietly, from a specific clause in EU regulatory law that had been interpreted inconsistently across member states, would have given Meridian a mechanism to trigger the clause under circumstances that weren't truly extraordinary. That qualifier, Ethan said to Davies, just loud enough for Vanessa to hear. The cas de perturbation réglementaire imprévue, the EU case law on that phrase is split. 3 decisions support the narrow reading, 2 support the broad one. If they get the broad reading in an arbitration, it covers a scenario that isn't actually unpredictable. Davies looked at him for a moment, then he looked at the attorney. We're not accepting that modification, Davies said. The attorney started to respond. Davies cut him off, politely, but clearly, with 3 specific case citations, one from a German arbitration panel, one from a Brussels commercial court, one from an English appellate decision that had been handed down 18 months ago and that the Meridian attorney clearly had not expected them to know. Renard wrote something on his notepad. The modification was withdrawn. At 6:30, Braun called a pause. He and Renard stepped out for 12 minutes. When they came back, Braun's posture was slightly different. Not defeated. Vanessa didn't think men like Braun did defeated, but recalibrated. The session that resumed was a different kind of session, more direct, more honest, in the strange way that negotiations become more honest when the angle isn't working anymore. At 7:54, the main outstanding points had been identified, flagged for revision, and tabled for a follow-up session to be scheduled within the week. Nothing had been signed. But the deal was still alive. More importantly, the clauses that would have cost Blackstone somewhere between $60 and $97 million, Davies' revised estimate, based on everything they'd caught, were sitting in a flagged pile rather than buried in ratified language. Ethan Walker sat at the end of the Blackstone table as the room emptied, his maintenance badge still clipped to his chest, his hands resting on the table in front of him. He looked tired. Not dramatically tired, just the kind of tired that comes from 4 hours of sustained concentration on top of a day that had already been a full day before the conference room. Across the emptying room, Renard paused on his way to the door. He looked at Ethan for a moment. "What were you doing in that hallway?" he asked. "Restocking paper towels," Ethan said. Renard looked at him for another moment. Then he said, in Osaka dialect Japanese, "Waste." He walked out. Vanessa found Ethan in the hallway retrieving his cart. She stood there for a moment, watching him check the spray bottle, tilted slightly like he was making sure something was upright underneath it, before she said anything. "Where did you learn all of that?" she said. He didn't look up immediately. When he did, he looked at her the way people look when they're deciding how much of something to give. "Different places?" he said. 8 languages. I didn't count. Our interpreters did." She crossed her arms, not defensively, thoughtfully. 8 languages. 4 countries' worth of specialized dialect and professional vocabulary. You caught things our entire panel missed. He didn't say anything. "That's not a coincidence," she said. "That's not something you pick up." "It is, actually," he said. "It's specifically something you pick up. That's the only way it works." She looked at him. "Formal language training, you learn what the words mean in a classroom," he said. "You learn what they mean correctly. You learn the grammar. You learn the structure. But you don't learn what they mean to people who use them every day to talk about their actual work. Dock workers don't use French the way a Paris classroom teaches French. They use French the way French works when you're trying to explain to a forklift operator in Liège that the container manifest is wrong and the load is going to shift if he doesn't reposition the stack." He paused. "That's a different language, same words, completely different language." Vanessa was quiet for a moment. "How many countries?" she said. He thought about it. 8, maybe 9, depending on how you count a 4-week stretch in Morocco. "How long?" He was quiet for a beat too long, and she understood from the specific quality of that silence that the answer involved something that wasn't simple. "Long enough," he said. She nodded, didn't push. You're going to be here tonight? She asked. 11 floor sweep. Yes. Don't leave without talking to me first, she said. He looked at her. Please, she added. Inchiti. At 9:53 p.m., long after the Meridian delegation had left and the conference room had been reset and most of the Blackstone executive floor had emptied out, Vanessa Hale sat in her office watching footage from the conference room cameras. She watched Ethan walk in. She watched the room's reaction. She watched him sit down and start working. And she watched the Meridian team's faces change, watched Renard's face specifically, that precise shift from predatory confidence to careful reassessment. She rewound it, watched it again. Then she opened her desk drawer and took out a pad of paper and a pen and started writing, not a note, not a memo. Something longer. Something that started with a question she couldn't quite answer yet and that she was going to need some time to think through. The question was, how do you lose something you never knew you had? 2 floors down, Ethan Walker mopped the hallway outside the conference room with the systematic thoroughness of someone who has learned that doing a job badly costs more in the long run than doing it right takes in the short term. At 11:47, his phone buzzed. A text from the school's automated system. Lily's teacher had sent a note Isio about a reading assessment tomorrow. Could he make sure she reviewed Chapter 4 tonight? He stopped mopping. He checked the time. 11:47. The babysitter went home at midnight. He looked at the half-mopped hallway, looked at his phone. Then he picked up the mop, finished the section he'd started, rinsed the head in the utility closet bucket, and took the service elevator down. Lily was already asleep when he got home. Of course she was. He sat on the edge of her bed in the dark for a minute, not touching her, just being there. The specific nightlight she'd picked out, yellow, shaped like a small sun, threw a warm stripe across the wall. He'd think about today tomorrow. He'd think about whatever Vanessa Hale wanted to talk about, and whatever came from it, and whether any of it changed anything. Tonight, he pulled the blanket up where Lily had kicked it half off, and turned out the sunlight, and went to bed. The $300 million deal was still alive. For now, that was someone else's problem. Vanessa didn't sleep well. That wasn't unusual. She hadn't slept a full night in probably 3 years. Not since the weight of the company had settled onto her in the particular way it settles when you stop being the owner's daughter and start being the owner. But this was a different kind of sleeplessness. Not the anxious kind, not the running numbers in her head kind. This was the kind that comes when you've seen something that doesn't fit any category you already have, and your brain refuses to file it away until it figures out where it belongs. She kept coming back to the moment Ethan had said statut de conformité restrictive. Not hesitantly, not searching, but the way you say a phrase you've used before, in conditions where getting it wrong had consequences. She got up at 5:15, made coffee that was better than the office version, and sat at her kitchen table with her laptop and the personnel file Marcus had quietly pulled for her before leaving last night. Ethan James Walker, age 32. Hired 11 months ago through a facilities contract agency. Emergency contact. A woman named Sandra Kowalski. Not a family name, she noted. Babysitter probably, or a neighbor. Previous employment before Blackstone was listed as various, which was the kind of entry that happened when someone had done a lot of different things in a lot of different places, and the HR form didn't have enough lines. His address was in the Riverside district, which was 40 minutes from the office by bus, and not the kind of neighborhood where people lived because they wanted to. There was no employment history before a gap that started about 4 years ago. 4 years. Something had happened 4 years ago, and after it, whatever his life had been before became various. She stared at that gap for a while. She didn't know what was in it. She knew she was going to find out. Davies called at 7:43. "I've been running the numbers," he said, without preamble. The sound of papers on his end suggested he'd been at his desk since before sunrise, which was exactly what she'd expected from him. Based on the language Renard's team was using, the specific clauses they were trying to build a foundation for, our exposure would have been between $82 and $96 million. Best case, if the arbitration went the wrong way on 2 of the clause interpretations, we're looking at potentially 120. Vanessa set down her coffee. $120 million, she said, over the life of the contract, but concentrated in the first 3 years, which is when our cash flow is thinnest. He paused. The notification window issue alone, the 72 hours versus 30 days, that one clause, if we'd signed it with the general definition in place, would have cost us the ability to respond to a regulatory event before penalty conditions triggered. That's not hypothetical. That's a scenario that has a real probability of occurring given the sectors this contract touches. All of it caught by a janitor. All of it caught by Ethan Walker. Davies' tone was careful. He was a man who believed in precision, including with words. I've been thinking about how he knew the Belgian Commercial Code, specifically Article 17. What do you know about him? Less than I'd like. His hire was standard, agency placement, background check, nothing remarkable. But I pulled his check-in logs from facilities management, and he's never missed a shift. 11 months, not one. He picks up extra slots when other staff call out. His supervisors have written him up twice, once for going outside his floor assignment, once for leaving supplies in an unauthorized storage area. Both times there were practical reasons that the supervisors acknowledged in the notes, but couldn't officially excuse. Vanessa thought about the folded piece of cardboard under the spray bottle, the cart with its wheel that caught on carpet. He knows how to work around a system, she said. He knows how to work, Davies said. There's a difference. She picked up her coffee again. I want to talk to him this morning. Can you be there? I'll clear my 9 o'clock. She got to the office at 8:30, which was earlier than usual and still not early enough to beat Marcus, who was already at his desk with a fresh cup of the office coffee and the day's schedule pulled up on both monitors. The Meridian team has requested a follow-up call for tomorrow afternoon, he said as she walked past. Braun's office sent the request at 6 a.m. Geneva time. That's aggressive, Vanessa said. Braun's office is always aggressive. What's the tone of the request? Marcus hesitated just slightly. Collegial, he said, which, given yesterday, is interesting. It was interesting. Braun requesting a call with the tone of a man who wanted to continue a partnership, not someone licking wounds. Either the session hadn't rattled them as much as she'd thought, or they were regrouping faster than she'd hoped, or, and this was the possibility that kept snagging at the back of her mind, they had a move she hadn't anticipated yet. Accept it, she said. Afternoon is fine, but I want Davies in that call. Done. Marcus made the note without looking up. Also, building management left a message. Something about an incident report from yesterday's session. Maintenance staff entering a restricted area during an active meeting. Vanessa stopped walking. Who filed it? Building operations supervisor. Name on the report is... Marcus checked. Frank DeLuca. She turned around. Tell Frank DeLuca that the incident report is under review and to hold any action pending my office's response. Marcus looked at her. Okay, he said slowly. And if he pushes back? Tell him I said please, Vanessa said, and kept walking. Ethan was in the basement. Not the parking structure basement, the sublevel where facilities management kept its supply inventory, the industrial kind. Drums of cleaning solution, stacked packs of paper products, replacement parts for the HVAC system that nobody had gotten around to installing yet. It smelled like chemical cleaner and old concrete, the specific underground smell of every large building's working guts. He was doing inventory, which was not his assigned task for the morning, but which needed doing because the guy who was supposed to do it had apparently quit without notice 2 days ago, and nobody had redistributed the work yet. This was, Vanessa gathered from the facilities coordinator who'd escorted her down, a pattern with Ethan. He found gaps and filled them, not because he was told to, but because gaps bothered him. He heard them coming and straightened up from the clipboard he'd been using before they reached the shelf row he was working on. When he saw Vanessa, his expression shifted in a way that was hard to read. Not quite surprise, not quite resignation. Something in between. He looked like a man who'd been half expecting this and half hoping it wouldn't happen. Ms. Hale, he said. Mr. Walker. She glanced at the clipboard. Do you have a few minutes? He looked at the half-counted shelf behind him. I've got a while, he said. I need to finish this, but it can wait. They found a corner near the door where there was a folding table someone had set up at some point and never removed. Davies leaned against the wall. Vanessa pulled out a chair and sat down, which seemed to catch Ethan slightly off guard. She got the sense he'd expected her to stay standing, which was the power position, the one that kept a certain distance. "I'm not here to fire you," she said. He pulled out the other chair and sat down. DeLuca filed a report. "I know. It's on hold." "It won't stay on hold." "No," she agreed. "It won't. But that's a separate problem, and we'll get to it." She put her hands on the table in front of her, not a gesture, just where they landed. "I want to understand what happened yesterday. Specifically, I want to understand how someone with your background ends up here." He was quiet for a moment, not uncomfortable, just thinking about how much to give. "My background," he said. 8 languages, Belgian commercial code, Austrian financial dialect, Osaka register Japanese. She kept her voice even. "That's not something that happens without a history behind it." Ethan looked at the wall behind her for a moment. Then he looked at her directly, which felt like a decision. "I had a different life before this one," he said. "For about 6 years I traveled. I took whatever work I could find in whatever country I ended up in. Docks, construction sites, farms, fish processing, cargo loading, anything that paid in cash or trade and didn't ask for too much documentation." He paused. "That was after my wife died." The room was quiet. Davies didn't move. "She was sick for about a year before the end," Ethan continued. "I was working a corporate translation job at the time, junior position, small firm, decent enough pay. When she got sick, I took family leave, used the savings, then borrowed against everything we had. When she died..." He stopped. Not emotionally, or not only emotionally, more like a man stopping to check his footing on uncertain ground. "Lily was 3. The debt was significant. The job was gone by then because I'd been out too long. And He looked at his hands on the table. "I wasn't in a good place. So I went somewhere else, several somewhere elses." "Lily came with you?" Vanessa asked. "No, she stayed with my mother-in-law for 2 years. Best decision I ever made and the worst 2 years of my life. Both at the same time." He said it flatly, like something that had been processed but not resolved. "I sent money back when I had it. I came home when I could, and then I came home for good and figured out how to rebuild something that looked like a stable life." Vanessa nodded. Didn't say anything for a moment. "The languages," Davies said carefully. "You worked with speakers, not from textbooks." "You can't learn Walloon French from a textbook," Ethan said. "There isn't one. You learn it from working alongside people who use it." He looked at Davies. "I spent 4 months in Liège loading freight. The men I worked with, most of them had been doing it for 20 years. When they talked about contracts, about weight limits, about liability when a load was damaged, they had specific language for all of it. I picked it up because you have to. You make expensive mistakes if you don't understand exactly what's being said." "And Renard recognized that," Vanessa said. "He knew you weren't a trained interpreter." "He knew the language was real," Ethan said. "That's the difference. Formal training gives you the language of the textbook. What I have is the language of the job." Renard's technique, embedding legal language in casual professional conversation, it works because trained interpreters are listening for one register and he's operating in another. He shrugged slightly. "I've spent 6 years in the second register." Davies opened the folder he'd been carrying. "Yesterday's session. Can you walk me through exactly what you heard in the hallway? Specifically the Japanese exchange. We didn't get complete notes on that." For the next 40 minutes, they went through it systematically. Ethan reconstructing the conversation from the hallway, the specific phrases, the context, the clause implications. Davies took notes. Vanessa asked questions. Ethan answered them without embellishment, without drama, with the specific directness of someone who was used to being the person who made sure the information was accurate because inaccurate information had costs. By the end of it, Davies' folder was full, and his expression was the one Vanessa associated with him working hard not to let something show. "How confident are you?" he said finally, in the Austrian tax liability translation. The phrase itself, completely confident. The clause mapping. Ethan hesitated. "That's your territory. I know what the words mean. Whether they attach to your Section 22 the way I think they do is a legal question." Davies looked at Vanessa. They do, he said. I spent 2 hours last night confirming it. She walked Ethan back to the elevator bay herself, which she hadn't planned to do. It just happened. DeLuca's report, she said while they waited. The technical violation is real. You went into a restricted area. I know, he said. That's the argument they're going to make. Who's they? She thought about how to answer that. Some of the executives who were in that room yesterday weren't happy about how it ended, she said. Not with you specifically, with the whole situation. When a strategy fails that publicly, people look for something to be angry at. The elevator came. He didn't get on immediately. What are you telling me? He said. I'm telling you that there's going to be noise, she said. I'm asking you to let me handle it without doing anything that makes it harder to handle. He looked at her for a moment. Like what? Like disappearing, taking a leave, going quiet. She crossed her arms. I need you to be here, and I need you to be findable. He considered that. I need the hours, he said. I'm not going anywhere. Good, she said. He got on the elevator. She stood in the doorway for a second, not dramatically, just thinking. One more question, she said. The Japanese at the end. When you responded to Renard, he looked at her. You told him you disagreed, that the deal's foundation wasn't compromised. Yes, he said. Did you believe that? Or were you playing a position? He thought about it, genuinely thought about it, which she hadn't entirely expected. Both, he said finally. The elevator doors closed. The noise started by afternoon. It came from a direction she'd partly anticipated and partly not. The board member who called was Richard Carver, 61, old money background, had been on the Blackstone board since before Vanessa's father had taken the company public. He was not a bad man, exactly. He was a man who had a very specific idea of how things should work, and a low tolerance for departures from that idea. I've had 3 calls this morning, he said, without small talk, from people who were in that room. I assumed you would, Vanessa said. The general tenor of the concern is that we had a significant security breach during a sensitive negotiation. An unauthorized individual saved us from an $80 to $120 million liability exposure, she said. A pause. That figure isn't confirmed. Davies confirms it. I can have him call you directly if you'd like the technical walkthrough. Another pause. Longer. Even granting that figure, Carver said, the procedural issue stands. We had someone without clearance, without any formal role in the negotiation, present for the entire afternoon session of a confidential contract discussion. The Meridian team is aware. Their legal team has already noted the irregularity. Their legal team noting an irregularity is interesting, Vanessa said, given that the irregularity is what kept their strategy from working. Vanessa. His voice had the specific quality of a man trying to be patient. I'm not saying the outcome wasn't fortunate. I'm saying the process was a problem. The board needs reassurance that this kind of thing doesn't happen in the future. I'm meeting with the board Thursday, she said. I'll address it then, in full. And in the meantime, the maintenance worker is doing his job, she said, which he's very good at. I'll talk to you Thursday, Richard. She ended the call before he could reframe the argument. Marcus appeared in her doorway 20 minutes later with the expression he wore when things had escalated while she was on the phone. Building operations confirmed the incident report has been processed, he said. DeLuca submitted it formally. Ethan Walker's supervisor has been notified. What does that mean in practice? Suspension pending review. It's automatic once the report is formalized. The facilities contract has a standard disciplinary provision. He hesitated. They're also recommending termination. DeLuca's notes cite repeated boundary violations. Vanessa put her pen down. Repeated, she said. The 2 previous write-ups. She was quiet for a moment. She thought about the inventory in the basement, the gap nobody had assigned, the fact that Ethan had filled it because gaps bothered him. Where is he now? He was notified about an hour ago. Building security escorted him out while his access is suspended. She picked up her phone and called Davies. The facilities contract, she said when he answered. Disciplinary override provisions. Who has authority? Technically the COO, Davies said, which is currently you given that position is vacant. So I can override DeLuca's recommendation. You can, but Carver and the board, I'm aware of Carver and the board. Can I override it? A brief silence. Yes, he said. Write me the memo, she said. I want the language tight. Ethan sat on a bench outside the building with his jacket on his lap and his phone in his hand, and the specific feeling of someone who has just had a door close on them for reasons that are familiar and still managed to be surprising. The suspension notice had come through the facility's coordinator, a young woman named Angela who looked genuinely pained about it, which he appreciated even if it didn't change anything. She'd used the phrase pending review 4 times in a 2-minute conversation, which was the kind of thing people said when they wanted to soften something that didn't actually have a soft version. He looked at his phone. 3:47. He had 45 minutes before he needed to start heading to school pickup. He called Sandra. Hey, she said. Everything okay? Change of plans for tonight, he said. I might be home earlier. How much earlier? Maybe permanently. A pause. Ethan? It's a maybe, he said. I'm figuring it out. He could hear her thinking on the other end, which was the sound of someone trying to find the right thing to say and not quite locating it. How's Lily doing with the reading assessment? He said. She practiced this morning. She's fine. She's going to be fine. Another pause. Are you okay? I'm sitting outside in the cold, he said. So, relatively. That bad? He looked up at the building, the glass exterior, the Blackstone Dynamics logo above the entrance, the revolving door that he'd pushed through hundreds of times with a cart that needed its left wheel adjusted. I did something yesterday, he said, that I thought was the right thing to do, and it might have been. But right things and good outcomes don't always... He stopped. Don't always what? Travel together, he said. I'll explain later. I'll be there at 5:30. He ended the call and sat on the bench and didn't look at the building anymore. His phone rang at 4:20. Unknown number. He almost didn't answer. Mr. Walker. The voice was formal, European accented, precise. Not Braun, not any of the voices from the table that he recognized. My name is Anton Vasily. I represent a consulting division of the Meridian Group's international operations. Ethan said nothing, which the man on the other end seemed to take as permission to continue. I'll be direct, Vasily said. We became aware of your situation with Blackstone Dynamics. The suspension. We understand a termination recommendation has been made. You move fast, Ethan said. We pay attention. A brief pause. We'd like to discuss an opportunity with you, Mr. Walker. At your convenience, of course, but we'd prefer sooner rather than later. What kind of opportunity? A senior position in international operations consulting, specifically cross-cultural negotiation support and strategic communication, which is precisely what you demonstrated yesterday. Another pause. The compensation would be substantially above your current arrangement. Ethan looked at the bench he was sitting on. The grain of the wood, a crack running along the left plank that somebody had filled with something dark and not quite the right color. Substantially, he said. We can discuss specifics in person. The role would involve travel, primarily European markets, with a home base arrangement that could accommodate family considerations. The man's voice was smooth and practiced, hitting the points in an order that suggested someone had thought carefully about what order they should be in. This is the same company, Ethan said, that spent yesterday afternoon trying to embed $80 million worth of liability into a contract without the other party knowing. A short silence. Negotiations are competitive processes, Vasily said carefully. Yes, Ethan said. They are. He thought about the phrase Renard had used in Japanese at the end. Waste. He thought about what Renard had meant by it. Not an insult, not quite a compliment. An assessment. I appreciate the call, Ethan said. I'll think about it. He ended it before Vasily could move to the next part of whatever script he was working from. Chas. At 4:51, as he was walking toward the bus stop, his phone rang again. This time the number was in the building's directory. He recognized it because he'd seen it on the emergency contact sheet in the facilities room. The number for the 32nd floor executive suite. He answered. "Where are you?" Vanessa said. "Heading to bus stop. I have school pickup at 5:30. "I know. This won't take long." Her voice had a different quality than the basement conversation, than the elevator conversation. Less careful, more direct, which was interesting because she'd seemed quite direct already. "The suspension is being overridden. You'll receive confirmation within the hour. Your access will be reinstated." He stopped walking. "The termination recommendation is rejected," she continued. "DeLuca will be notified. There will be a formal record of the override with my signature on it." He stood on the sidewalk in the cold with his jacket in one hand and his phone in the other. "Why?" he said. "Because the recommendation was retaliatory and the rationale doesn't hold." She was quiet for a second. "And because I looked at your file this morning and your previous write-ups, the floor assignment, the supply storage, both times you were filling gaps that shouldn't have existed, which means we've been writing up the person cleaning up our own operational failures." He didn't say anything immediately. "I'm also—" She paused, and for the first time he heard something in her voice that wasn't entirely controlled, just slightly. "I'm working on something else. A longer conversation. About what yesterday means, and what we do with it. That conversation is going to take time, and there are people who are going to push back on it, and I need you to be here for it. You said that this morning. I'm saying it again." A brief pause. "Did someone from Meridian contact you?" He blinked. "Yes?" "I expected that." Her voice was flat, not angry, just noting a fact. "What did they offer?" "They were vague about specifics, senior consulting role, European markets. They mentioned compensation." "Are you considering it?" The honest answer was that he'd been sitting on a bench outside the building doing exactly that. But it was also true that sitting on a bench doing something and being willing to admit it to the person who'd just reinstated your access were different things. "I'm keeping it in mind," he said. A pause. "That's fair," she said, which surprised him. "Keep it in mind, and show up tomorrow." He looked at the bus stop sign at the end of the block. He thought about the Chapter 4 Lily needed to review tonight. He thought about Sandra's voice on the phone, on shot. He thought about $80 million and a folded piece of cardboard under a spray bottle, and a man in a suit who'd looked at him from across a conference table and said waste like it was a verdict. "I'll be there," he said. "Good," she said. He put his phone in his pocket and started walking. The wind was picking up from the east. The cold kind, the kind that meant rain by morning. He walked faster, calculating whether the bus would be on time or whether he needed to call Sandra to cover the pickup, going through the small arithmetic of his days the way he always did. The way you do when you're the only buffer between your kid and the things that go wrong. Somewhere above him, on the 32nd floor, Vanessa Hale was looking at a handwritten note that said, "How do you lose something you never knew you had?" and beginning to understand that the question had an answer she wasn't entirely prepared for. And in a hotel conference room across the city, Claude Renard was on a call with Anton Vasile, listening to the report about Ethan Walker, listening to the word considering, and writing one word on his notepad. Patience. The rain came exactly when the wind had promised it would. By 7 the next morning, it was steady and gray outside the Blackstone building, the kind of rain that doesn't commit to being dramatic, but doesn't let up either. Ethan came through the employee entrance at 6:58 with his jacket darkened across the shoulders and a paper bag from the bakery 2 blocks over that Lily had insisted on when he dropped her at school. "You have to eat breakfast, Dad. Mrs. Patterson says adults who skip breakfast make bad decisions," and found his access card working again at the door reader. The small green light. Nothing ceremonial about it, just a green light, same as always. He went to the supply closet on 31, checked the cart, found someone had refilled it overnight. That was new. He stood there for a second looking at the restocked shelves and thought about what it meant that someone had done that without being asked, and then he stopped thinking about it because thinking about it wasn't useful. He had a floor to cover, Chad. Vanessa got to the office at 7:30 to find Marcus waiting with a look that she'd learned to classify by now. This particular look meant that something had happened that she hadn't been warned about, and that it wasn't good, and that Marcus was sorry to be the one delivering it. "Board meeting," he said. "Emergency session. Carver called it last night, 9 a.m. She stopped moving. He can call emergency sessions? Technically, any board member can request one with 48 hours notice. He filed the request yesterday at 5 p.m., which means 48 hours from 5 p.m. yesterday is 5 p.m. today, not 9 a.m. Marcus handed her the email. He got 3 other members to co-sign. With 4 members requesting, the notice window drops to 12 hours. She read the email. It was formal, precise, and had Carver's fingerprints all over it. The language of a man who had spent decades learning exactly how to use procedural mechanisms to move things in the direction he wanted without appearing to push. The subject of the emergency session was listed as Operational Security and Personnel Protocol Review. "He's moving fast," she said. "He talked to someone from Meridian's legal team yesterday evening. I don't have details, but the call lasted 40 minutes. Vanessa folded the email and handed it back. "Get Davies, now." Davies arrived in her office at 7:50 with 2 cups of coffee, office quality, but hot, and the look of a man who had also been awake early and had also seen the email and had also been running scenarios. "They're going to use the security angle," he said before she could start. "The argument is that an unauthorized individual was present for a confidential negotiation session. The fact that the outcome was favorable doesn't change the procedural breach. And in fact," he paused, "Carver's version of the argument will be that the favorable outcome was luck, that it could have gone the other way, that we can't build operational security on lucky accidents. Is that argument legally sound? It's not legally relevant. This isn't a legal proceeding. It's a board meeting. The argument just needs to be politically sound." He sat down. "And it is, for about half the people in that room. Reyes and Park are both concerned about the Meridian relationship. They don't want to give Meridian grounds to claim the negotiation was compromised by an unauthorized party. Meridian already knows what Ethan did. They're not going to claim the negotiation was compromised. They'd be admitting their own strategy failed. They don't have to claim it formally. They just have to whisper it to the right people in the right rooms, and suddenly there's enough uncertainty about the deal's integrity that we're the ones with the problem." Davies drank his coffee. "Carver is good at this. You know that." She knew that. She'd watched Carver operate in boardrooms since she was 23, when she'd sat in the back during quarterly reviews as her father's observer and tried to understand why certain arguments landed and others didn't. Carver's skill wasn't intelligence, exactly. He was smart, but not the smartest person in most rooms he occupied. His skill was timing and coalition. He knew which 3 people to talk to before a meeting to make sure his position had momentum before the discussion even started. He'd already talked to 4. "What's my strongest play?" she said. Davies thought about it, really thought. She could see him working through it, discarding options, testing others. That was why she paid him what she paid him. "Numbers," he said finally. "Not procedural arguments, not principal arguments. Numbers. $82 to $120 million in avoided liability exposure. Put that on a slide. Make it impossible to sit in the room and vote to fire the person responsible for that number without explicitly acknowledging that you are doing so. Carver will say the interpreters would have caught it eventually." "Would they have?" She looked at him. "I've been reviewing the session recordings," Davies said. "All of it, including the peripheral audio. I had a transcript run and then I asked Chen to review the peripheral sections." He opened his folder. Chen confirmed that she missed 17 substantive exchanges. 17. Not noise, language that was directly relevant to clause interpretation. Of those 17, Ethan caught 14 during the session. The other 3 he reconstructed afterward from memory during our basement meeting. 17, Vanessa said. 17 times Renard's team said something that mattered, in a register designed to slide past trained interpreters. 17 times the 20 people we paid to catch exactly that kind of thing didn't catch it. He closed the folder. The board can argue process all they want. The numbers are the numbers. The board meeting was in the smaller conference room on the 30th floor. 8 people around a round table, which was the format Carver preferred because it flattened hierarchy and made it easier to run a consensus argument without appearing to lead one. Vanessa recognized the setup the moment she walked in. She'd seen her father navigate it a dozen times. Carver opened with the security framing exactly as Davies had predicted. precise, measured, genuinely concerned sounding. He made it about the company, about the Meridian relationship, about the principle of operational integrity. He did not once say, fire the janitor. He talked about reviewing personnel protocols and ensuring appropriate access controls and protecting the company's negotiating posture in future sessions. It was good. She'd give him that. She let him finish. Let Reyes add her concern about the Meridian relationship. Let Park ask whether Blackstone's legal exposure from the unauthorized presence could be quantified. Then she put the slide up. One number on a white background, $97 million. That's the midpoint of our estimated avoided liability exposure from the session in question, she said. Davies has the full technical breakdown if anyone wants to go through it. The range is $82 to $120 million, concentrated in the first 3 contract years. Every dollar of that exposure was caught by Ethan Walker. She let that sit for a moment. Our 20 professional interpreters missed 17 substantive exchanges during the afternoon session. 17 instances where Meridian's team embedded legally relevant language in casual conversation, in dialects and registers specifically chosen to avoid standard corporate translation. She advanced to the next slide. Chen's transcript review, the 17 instances listed with brief descriptions. Ethan Walker caught 14 of those 17 in real time. The other 3 he reconstructed from memory afterward, all of which Davies confirmed upon review. The room was quiet. Carver said, "Vanessa, no one is questioning the outcome." "I know," she said. "I'm questioning the framing. The framing I'm hearing is that we need to protect the company from a man who saved it from a 9-figure loss. I'd like to understand what that protection looks like in practice." "The protection is about precedent," Carver said, "about making clear that unauthorized access to sensitive negotiations is not something the company rewards regardless of outcome. If we make an exception here, we're not making an exception," she said. "We're making a judgment. There's a difference." She looked around the table, not at Carver, at the others. Reyes, whose concern was the Meridian relationship. Park, whose concern was legal exposure. Howard, who hadn't said anything yet and was the one she was least sure about. The judgment is this: a man identified a problem, acted on it under difficult conditions, and protected this company from significant harm. He did that because he understood something our professional team missed, using knowledge he acquired over 6 years of working in conditions that most people in this room haven't experienced. The question isn't whether he followed the correct procedure. The question is what we do with someone like that. Another silence. Howard, 62, former operations background, the most pragmatic person in the room, said, "What are you proposing?" "Not today," she said. "Today I'm proposing that the suspension be formally lifted and the termination recommendation be rejected on record. What comes after that is a longer conversation I'd like to have with this board under normal session conditions, not an emergency meeting called on 12 hours' notice." She looked at Carver when she said the last part, not accusatorially, just acknowledging what they both knew. Carver held her gaze for a moment, then looked at his notepad. The vote to reject the termination recommendation passed 6-2. Carver and Reyes against. Everyone else, including Howard, for. It wasn't a victory exactly. It was a held position, and Vanessa knew the difference. She found Davies at the hallway afterward, and they walked back toward the elevators without talking for a moment, the way people walk when they're processing. "Reyes surprised me," Davies said. "Reyes wasn't wrong," Vanessa said. "The Meridian concern is real. If they use the unauthorized presence as a reason to challenge the negotiation's validity, they won't. It's not in their interest. They'd be acknowledging their own strategy was caught and identified." He paused. Although what? "Renard isn't finished," Davies said. "He didn't get what he wanted in that room. That's not a man who accepts that and moves on." She thought about the call Vasile had made to Ethan the day before. Senior position. European markets, substantially above current arrangement. She thought about Renard's notepad. Patience. "No," she said. "He's not." Ethan heard about the board meeting outcome from Angela in facilities, who heard it from someone in building operations, who apparently had a contact on the administrative staff. The specific mechanics of how building information traveled were something Ethan had learned early. The cleaning staff always knew things before the executive floor knew they knew, because the cleaning staff heard everything, and most people in offices treated them like furniture. He was running his floor sweep when Angela found him and said, "The board voted. You're staying." He kept the mop moving. "How close?" 6-2. 6-2. 4 people in a room of 8 had made the decision as if it required thought. He didn't say anything, and Angela, who was 24 and had good instincts about when to leave silences alone, left the silence alone. At 11:15, his phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. The message was in Japanese, not formal Japanese, the Osaka inflection, which meant only one person in the city who had his number would have sent it. "The door we discussed is still open. Time is a factor. V. Not Vasil. Renard." He stood in the hallway of the 31st floor with his phone in his hand and read the message twice. Then he put the phone back in his pocket and went to restock the paper towel dispensers in the East Wing restrooms, because that was what was next on the list. The follow-up call with Meridian's team happened at 2 p.m., as scheduled. Vanessa sat at the head of the conference table with Davies to her left and 2 members of the legal team across from her, all 4 of them on a video connection with Braun's team in Geneva. Braun was on camera. Renard was not visible, which meant either he wasn't in the room or he was deliberately out of frame, and she suspected the latter. Braun opened with pleasantries, which was the first signal that the temperature had changed. The man she'd sat across from 2 days ago had been formal and efficient. This version of Braun was warmer, almost collegial the way people get when they've decided to try a different approach. "We appreciated the session," Braun said. "The depth of engagement from your team was impressive." "We have a strong team," Vanessa said. "Indeed." A slight pause. "We were particularly struck by the contribution of the individual who joined the afternoon session. The maintenance staff member, I believe." "Mr. Walker, yes." "Quite remarkable. His language background is extensive." "It is," she said, neither confirming nor denying anything about what Ethan's current status was or wasn't. Braun nodded slowly. "We've been reviewing the outstanding points from Tuesday's session. Our legal team has prepared revised language on several of the flagged clauses." He glanced at someone off camera. "We'd like to propose a revised framework for Section 14 specifically." Davies was already pulling up the documents on his laptop. He scrolled to Section 14 and his eyes moved fast across the proposed revisions. "Give me a moment," he said, not to Braun, but to Vanessa, quietly enough that the video feed probably didn't catch it. She gave him the moment, kept her attention on Braun, who was doing the thing that experienced negotiators do during pauses, remaining comfortable in the silence, not filling it, letting the other side use it however they needed to. Davies wrote something on the notepad beside his laptop and pushed it toward her without looking up from the screen. "Language is cleaner. Most flags addressed, but subclause 14, D, new insertion. Liability trigger on regulatory audit initiation, not audit finding. That's worse than the original." She read it without reacting. "Mr. Braun," she said, "the revised framework looks substantially improved on the main flags. We'll need to work through the details on subclause 14D. The audit trigger language is new and needs technical review." Braun nodded. "Of course. Can we schedule a working session for that clause specifically? Davies and your legal lead, technical level?" "Certainly." Braun smiled, which was a thing she'd seen him do twice now, and which didn't yet feel entirely natural on his face. "We're committed to getting this right. Both parties benefit from a clean agreement." After the call ended, Davies sat back and looked at the ceiling for a moment. "Subclause 14, D," he said. "Tell me." The original force majeure issue was about regulatory non-compliance triggering penalties. They've addressed that. But 14D moves the liability trigger to the initiation of a regulatory audit. Not the finding, the initiation. That means if any regulatory body anywhere opens a preliminary inquiry into any aspect of the contract's implementation, the liability shift activates before there's been any determination of actual wrongdoing. Vanessa stared at him. "It's elegant," Davies said, with the tone of someone giving credit they don't want to give. "If you're not reading for it, it looks like they've cleaned up the section. The headline language is better. The embedded clause is worse, and it's buried in new language in a spot where the eye naturally moves past it after processing the improvements above. Renard, she said, has to be. That's not a drafting error. That's a deliberate insertion in a position designed to be overlooked after the main revision appears accommodating. She thought about the video call, Braun's warmth, the slight pause before he mentioned Ethan, the smooth pivot to the revised framework. He knew we'd be reviewing it hard, she said. Yes, so, Davies said, which means he also knew we'd probably catch it. Then why include it? Davies was quiet for a moment. I don't know, he said, which was not something he said often, unless catching it is part of the point. She was still thinking about that when her phone rang at 3:40. Not Carver, not Marcus, not anyone from the building. The number had a country code she recognized, Belgium. She answered. Ms. Hale. The voice was older, female, with an accent that was French but not French, such Belgian specifically, and educated. My name is Isabelle Marchand. I am calling from the firm Marchand, Delacroix and Associates in Brussels. We are legal counsel to several parties with an interest in the Meridian Group's current negotiating activities. Vanessa said nothing, waiting. I'll be direct, Marchand said. The Meridian Group is currently under a preliminary regulatory inquiry by the Belgian Financial Authority regarding their use of negotiating practices that may constitute misrepresentation under EU commercial law. Specifically, the practice of embedding contractually relevant language in non-formal communication channels during negotiation sessions in a manner designed to avoid detection by counterparty translation resources. The room felt very still. That inquiry, Marchand continued, has a documentation component. We are aware that Blackstone Dynamics' recent negotiation session generated recordings that may be relevant to that inquiry. I am calling to inform you that a formal request for those recordings may be forthcoming and to determine whether your organization would be cooperative in that process. Vanessa said, How aware of this inquiry is the Meridian Group? A brief pause. Sufficiently aware that they would have strategic reasons to conclude the Blackstone contract quickly, under terms they control, before the inquiry moves to a stage that complicates their operational position. Vanessa closed her eyes for exactly 2 seconds, then opened them. Ms. Marchand, she said, I'll need to consult with our legal team before committing to anything. Can you send written documentation of the inquiry to Davies at our legal department? Of course. I'll send it within the hour. The call ended. Vanessa sat in the silence for a moment. Then she said to the empty room, That's why. Catching the embedded clause was part of the point. Meridian needed the deal to close, fast and on terms that were documented as consensual and fair, before a Belgian regulatory inquiry got far enough to create real complications. Which meant Renard's revised framework, clever as subclause 14, D wasn't actually the primary move. The primary move was the pressure to close. The embedded clause was either a test of how hard Blackstone was reading or a fallback negotiating chip, or both. And Ethan Walker, the question about him in the video call, the Vasile offer, the Japanese text from Renard's number. That wasn't just Meridian being opportunistic about a talent they'd spotted. It was a move to remove their primary problem from the opposing team's bench. She picked up her phone and called Ethan. He answered on the third ring. Background sounds. Hallway, cartwheels. I need you in my office, she said. Now, if you can. I'm on 31. Take the elevator. I'll tell security. A pause. Is this another basement conversation or a real office conversation? Real office, she said. Another pause, shorter. Okay, he said. Give me 5 minutes. He came in looking the way he always looked. Maintenance badge, jacket with the slightly worn left elbow, the specific quality of someone who had learned not to adjust their appearance for rooms, because adjusting your appearance for rooms was a kind of pretending he'd apparently decided to stop doing. She told him about Marchand's call, all of it, including her interpretation of what it meant. He listened without interrupting, which was something she'd started to notice about him. The quality of his listening was different from most people's. He wasn't forming responses while she talked. He was actually just taking it in. When she finished, he said, "So they need to close the deal before the inquiry complicates it." That's my read. Which means they need it closed on their terms, because a deal closed on our terms with the regulatory inquiry in the background doesn't help them the way they need it to. Yes. He thought about it. Subclause 14, D, isn't what they actually need then. Probably not. They need us to think we've caught everything. So we close feeling like we've won, and the thing we didn't catch is something smaller, something that doesn't look like the main issue, but that serves the same function in a different way. Vanessa looked at him. That's what I'm thinking. He nodded slowly. You need someone to read the whole revised framework, every line, not just the flagged sections. Davies is doing that. Davies is doing it with fresh eyes on the revisions. He's going to read harder where the changes are and lighter where the original language stayed. He paused. You need someone reading the original language like it's also new. She held his gaze. I can do that tonight, he said, if you can get me the document. She thought about Carver. She thought about the 6-2 vote and what the two were waiting for. She thought about the fact that what she was about to do would be visible, recorded, attributable. I'll have Marcus send it to your personal email, she said, not through the company system. He nodded, started to stand. Ethan, she said. He stopped. Meridian reached out to you. Renard sent you a message today. She watched his face, which gave her just enough to work with. I'm not asking you to tell me what you're going to do, but I need to know if you're still on this side of the table. He looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone working out whether a question is as simple as it sounds. I was sitting on a bench outside this building yesterday, he said, thinking about whether I had any options. I've got a daughter, and a debt load, and a facilities job that just tried to fire me because I did something that saved this company $97 million. He stopped. Not dramatically, just checking whether the next part needed to be said. The question of which side of the table I'm on isn't complicated. It's the other questions that are complicated. What other questions? He stood up. Whether being on your side of the table means anything, what it means in practice, what I'm worth to you when the board stops being angry and starts being calculating. He said it without bitterness, which somehow made it land harder. Those are the questions. I'll have the document reviewed by morning. He left. She sat there for a moment with the weight of what he'd said doing what it needed to do. Then she picked up her pen and wrote at the bottom of the notepad page under the earlier question, the answer is you lose it the same way you lose everything else, by not looking. Chad. He worked through the contract at the kitchen table after Lily went to bed. The document was 112 pages. He started from page 1, not the revised sections, not the flagged areas. Page 1 and forward. He had a legal dictionary pulled up on his phone and 3 handwritten pages of notes by the time he got to section 9. Not because section 9 had been flagged, it hadn't, but the language in section 9, subclause B, had a cross-reference to section 22 that used a conjunction Ethan recognized. Not from any formal legal context. From a construction contract dispute in Stuttgart that he'd watched play out over 6 weeks while working a site there, between a German contractor and an Austrian firm, where a single conjunction and a cross-reference clause had determined which party bore the cost of a delayed permit. The conjunction meant in slash or informal German. In Austrian commercial practice, applied to cross-reference clauses, it had been consistently interpreted as and, not or. The difference was whether both conditions had to be met or only one. In the context of Section 9b, cross-referencing Section 22, the difference was which party bore responsibility for regulatory compliance costs when a subsidiary contract was involved. He sat back and looked at what he'd written. It wasn't the main issue. It wasn't a 9-figure exposure. By his rough estimate, it was somewhere in the low tens of millions over the contract life. Meaningful, but not catastrophic, and exactly the kind of number that could get accepted in a negotiation as the cost of reaching agreement. Subclause 14, D, was the thing they were supposed to catch. This was the thing they were supposed to miss. He picked up his phone and typed a message to Vanessa's number. Not a call. It was 11:40, and she might be asleep, though he doubted it. Section 9b. The cross-reference to Section 22. The conjunction in the original German draft, if that's how the underlying version reads, changes the compliance cost allocation. Not a major clause, but not nothing. Could be the real play, while 14D is the distraction. He put the phone down and went back to page 1 of section 9, reading it again more slowly. Lily's nightlight threw a yellow stripe across the hallway floor. The rain had stopped at some point, and outside the window the street was quiet and wet and lit orange from the lights below. He had 64 more pages to read. He turned the page. Vanessa saw the message at 11:53, which meant she hadn't been asleep. She was at her kitchen table with the same document open on her laptop, a half-drunk glass of water beside it, working through the revised sections with the kind of focus that left her eyes dry and her back stiff. When the message came through, she read it once, then pulled up section 9 on her screen and found subclause B and read it slowly, and then read it again. Then she called Davies. He answered on the second ring, which told her she wasn't the only one awake. Section 9, B, she said. Cross-reference to section 22, the conjunction. A pause, papers moving. Give me a minute. She waited. Heard him reading, heard the specific silence of someone who has just found what they were looking for and is taking a moment to be sure. The original term sheet, he said finally. The underlying draft was prepared by Meridian's Geneva office. Their standard contract language is built on a German law framework. Another pause. If the conjunction carries the Austrian commercial interpretation, Ethan thinks it does. Then the compliance cost allocation for subsidiary contracts shifts to us, not in every scenario, only when both a regulatory event and a subsidiary trigger occur simultaneously. But that's not a rare scenario in the sectors this contract touches. Over the contract life, at historical frequency rates for the relevant regulatory events in the EU pharmaceutical and logistics space. He stopped. She could hear him calculating. Somewhere between $12 and $18 million. Not catastrophic, she said. No, but you don't need catastrophic if you've already accepted it as the cost of reaching agreement. A pause. Subclause 14D was the decoy. That's what Ethan thinks. Davies was quiet for a moment. He read 112 pages in, 3 hours? He's still reading. Another pause, longer this time. When Davies spoke again, his voice had changed in a way that was subtle but real. A slight recalibration, the sound of someone updating an assessment they'd already made and finding they need to update it further. What are you planning to do with him, Vanessa? It was the first time he'd used her first name in a professional context in 18 months. She noticed it. I'm still working on that, she said. Work faster, he said. Meridian isn't the only one paying attention to him now. Chat. She told him in the morning, not in a formal meeting, not with Davies present, not in the conference room or her office. In the hallway outside the supply closet on 31 at 7:22, while Ethan was checking the cart's spray bottle and she was holding 2 coffees from the place 2 blocks over that she'd started stopping at on the way in. She handed him one. He took it without making it a thing, which she appreciated. Section 9, B, was the real play, she said. Davies confirmed it last night. 12 to 18 million in compliance cost exposure over the contract life. He nodded. He looked like a man who had slept about 4 hours and was running on the specific energy of someone accustomed to functioning below full capacity. Subclause 14, D, the audit trigger language. We're going to push back on that in the working session. They'll concede it. That's the point of it. He looked at his coffee. They concede the obvious thing. We feel like we've held the line. We missed the thing that stayed quiet in Section 9. Except we didn't miss it. Except we didn't miss it, he agreed. She stood with him in the hallway for a moment. The building was coming alive around them. Elevators, distant voices, the particular morning building sounds of a large organization waking up and starting its machinery. I want to talk to you about something, she said. Separate from the contract. He looked at her. There's going to be a board conversation next week, she said, about what role, if any, you should have going forward. Not maintenance. Something with a formal title and a formal salary and a formal place in the organizational structure. She kept her voice level, not making it bigger than it was. I want to have that conversation with you before I have it with them. He was quiet for a moment. Not the way people are quiet when they're pleased and trying not to show it. The way people are quiet when something lands in a complicated place. What kind of role? He said. Officially, it would be something in international operations, strategy and communication support. The specifics need work. She paused. Honestly, the role doesn't fully exist yet. I'd be building it around what you actually do, not fitting you into something already defined. That's a significant thing to offer someone based on 2 days. I know. The board knows about the Meridian offer? She hesitated just slightly. Not yet. He nodded slowly, turned the coffee cup in his hand. If I take a position here and the Meridian deal closes and the board moves on, 6 months from now, when none of this is current anymore, what's the case for keeping me? It was a fair question. She'd asked it of herself at 2 a.m. and hadn't fully answered it. That depends on what you do in those 6 months, she said, which depends on what I'm allowed to do, which depends on the board conversation. She held his gaze. I know it's circular, that's what I'm trying to cut through. He looked at her for a long moment with the expression she'd come to recognize as him deciding how much of something to give. My daughter has a dentist appointment Friday, he said. I need to be able to leave at 3. She blinked. Okay? I've taken 2 personal days in 11 months. I want to know whether a formal role means less flexibility or more, because right now, technically, I can move my schedule around as long as the work gets done. I don't know if that's still possible in a different position. She almost smiled and stopped herself. We can make it work. I'm not saying yes, he said. I'm saying I'll think about it. That's all I'm asking. He went back to checking the cart. She stood there for another second, not awkwardly, just finishing the moment, and then walked toward the elevator. Behind her, she heard him say, "The coffee's better than the office stuff." I know, she said, without turning around. The working session on Section 14 happened Thursday afternoon. Davies and Meridian's lead attorney, a man named Hoffman, sat across from each other at the smaller conference table with their respective legal teams flanking them. Vanessa was present but not leading. This was Davies' session, technical and specific, the kind of meeting that needed a lawyer's precision rather than an executive's authority. Ethan was not in the room. He was on 31, running his floor sweep, which was where he was supposed to be and where he'd told Vanessa he'd be when she'd asked whether he wanted to be there. I'll be more useful not being there, he'd said. Why? Because if I'm in the room, Hoffman is going to be thinking about me instead of the document. And if he's thinking about me, he's going to be careful in ways that make it harder to read what they actually want. She'd thought about it. He was right. So she'd had him write a briefing note instead. 3 pages, handwritten because he said he thought better that way, which she'd had Marcus type up and print for Davies. The note identified subclause 14D as the expected concession point, flagged the Section 9B conjunction issue with a specific recommendation for revised language, and noted 2 other smaller concerns in Sections 17 and 21 that were worth clarifying but weren't structural problems. Davies had read it that morning. His comment had been, "This is what a senior contract analyst produces after a week of review. He did it overnight." Now Davies was sitting across from Hoffman and working through the document with the methodical precision that was his primary professional value. And Vanessa was watching Hoffman's face the way she'd watched Reynard's face in the original session, looking for the tells. Subclause 14 D came up at the 40-minute mark. Hoffman pushed back briefly, the performance of resistance, and then conceded the audit trigger language with a revised proposal that moved the trigger to audit finding rather than initiation. Clean, reasonable, exactly what a good faith negotiating partner would offer. Davies accepted it and moved on. Vanessa watched Hoffman's shoulders drop by about half an inch, the specific physical release of a man whose expected outcome had just occurred. 20 minutes later, Davies said, Section 9, subclause B. The conjunction in the compliance cost cross-reference. Hoffman's shoulders did not drop. They did something else, a very small tightening, barely visible, the kind of physical response that happens before the conscious mind has decided how to react. The conjunction, he said. In the original German framework language, the UN/oder construction applied to the cross-reference to Section 22. Our reading is that the Austrian commercial interpretation applies, given the origin of the underlying draft. Davies slid a page across the table. We'd like to resolve the ambiguity with explicit language clarifying the or reading. Either condition sufficient, not both required. Hoffman looked at the page. Looked at it for longer than a man looks at something that doesn't contain a problem. I'll need to consult with Geneva on this point, he said. Of course, Davies said. We can recess for 30 minutes, if that helps. The 30-minute recess lasted 55 minutes. Vanessa spent it in the hallway outside the conference room, drinking water and not checking her phone, which was a discipline she'd developed because checking her phone during recesses was how you let anxiety run the session. Davies came out at the 20-minute mark and stood beside her. He called Geneva, Davies said, low enough that it didn't carry. I could hear the call through the door. He spoke German, which tells you something. What did you hear? Enough to know that the Section 9 issue was not supposed to come up. He paused. The word unmöglich, impossible, was used twice, and a name, Renard. She absorbed that. They're recalibrating, she said. They're recalibrating, he confirmed. Which means the Section 9 language was deliberate, which means Ethan was right, which means Renard built a fallback into the original language and was counting on us accepting the 14D concession as the win and not reading back into the sections we hadn't flagged. Davies looked at the closed conference room door. He's going to come back in and offer a compromise on the conjunction language, not the full revision we want, something that looks like a compromise but preserves some of the ambiguity. Don't accept it, she said. I know. He paused. Vanessa, when you go back to the board next week, the conversation about Ethan's role, you should know that Hoffman clocked the name in my briefing notes. She looked at him. You had his name on the document? Standard sourcing notation. E. Walker, briefing. Hoffman saw it. Davies's voice was careful. He called Geneva, and Geneva called Renard, and Renard now knows that Ethan is working this negotiation from the inside, not in maintenance. The hallway felt slightly colder. Then we need to move faster than I planned, she said. Hoffman's compromise proposal on the conjunction language was exactly what Davies had predicted. A clarifying note that acknowledged the ambiguity without resolving it, appended as an addendum rather than integrated into the clause itself. In practice, it preserved Meridian's ability to argue the Austrian interpretation in arbitration while appearing to address Blackstone's concern. Davies rejected it. He did it politely, specifically, and with 3 pages of supporting language that Ethan had drafted the night before for exactly this scenario, which Davies had adapted into formal legal prose. The alternative revision he proposed was clean, unambiguous, and left no room for the interpretation Meridian wanted. Hoffman went back to his documents, came back with a counter. Davies countered the counter. By 6 p.m., they had agreed on revised language for Section 9b that explicitly adopted the or reading and cross-referenced both the Belgian and Austrian commercial precedents that informed the interpretation. It wasn't everything. There were still outstanding points in Sections 17 and 21 that needed another round. But the structural risk was closed. Davies called Vanessa from the conference room before she'd gotten to the elevator. Section 9 is clean, he said. We have language. She stopped walking. How did Hoffman take it? Professionally, he's good at his job. A pause. He made one comment at the end that you should know about. Tell me. He said, and I'm quoting, "Please convey our regards to Mr. Walker. His reading of the document was thorough." Davies paused again. It wasn't a compliment. It was an acknowledgement. There's a difference. I know the difference, she said. She told Ethan that evening, in the elevator going down, she'd caught him at the end of his shift, which she'd started to notice she was doing more deliberately than she'd originally admitted to herself. Hoffman sent regards, she said. Ethan looked at the elevator floor numbers. That's one way to put it. They know you're reading the contract. Renard knows. He nodded, once. It wasn't surprise. Does that change the Meridian offer calculation for you? She said. He was quiet for a moment. The elevator descended through 20, 19, 18. Renard made the offer because he wanted to remove a problem, he said. If I take it, I'm not an asset to them. I'm a managed risk. They'd put me somewhere visible and useful enough to justify the salary, and somewhere they could watch what I was doing. He paused. That's not a job. That's a different kind of fence. She looked at him. I've lived inside enough fences, he said. I know what they feel like. 16, 15, 14. The board meeting is Monday, she said. I'm going to propose a formal role. Senior International Strategy Analyst. That's the title I'm working with. It's not perfect, but it's defensible within the existing structure. She paused. Carver is going to push back. What does Carver want? Carver wants the company run the way companies like this have always been run. Predictably, within established protocols, with people in the roles they were hired for. She said it without heat. He's not wrong that there's a value in that. He's just wrong about what it costs. And the others? Howard is movable. Reyes is the harder case. She's still worried about the Meredessa relationship and whether having you formally in the negotiation changes Meridian's legal position on challenging the process. She thought about the 6-2 vote from the emergency session and what it had cost to get there. I need 3 more votes beyond what I have. Howard is one. The other 2 are going to require a case that goes beyond this deal. What kind of case? She looked at him. That's what I've been trying to figure out. 11, 10, 9. There's a program, he said. Or there could be. Not just me. Systematic. A way of identifying people in the organization who have skills and knowledge that don't match their current roles. Not because of failures on their part, but because nobody ever asked. He said it carefully, like a person who's had an idea for a while and hasn't said it out loud. I'm not the only one. The woman who runs the mailroom, Sarah, I've talked to her. She has an accounting background from before she immigrated. Took the mailroom job to get into any organization and never got moved. The guy who does IT hardware on 28, he's been building financial models on his own time for 3 years, never shown anyone. The elevator stopped. Ground floor. The doors opened. Neither of them moved for a second. You've been thinking about this, she said. I've had time, he said. Night shifts are quiet. She stepped out. He followed. In the lobby, with the evening city visible through the glass, she stopped and turned to face him. If I build that case, the program, I need data, names, backgrounds, the specifics of what's being missed, she paused. That's work that's not in your job description. Lots of things aren't in my job description, he said. She almost said something that would have been too much, like she could feel it forming and stopped it. Instead, she said, Monday, be in the building. I'm always in the building, he said, and pushed through the door into the evening. Ouch. The weekend was quiet and wasn't. Saturday morning was Lily and the library, which was a non-negotiable weekend fixture. Lily had opinions about which library, which section, which table, and Ethan had learned to navigate all 3 with the specific diplomacy required by a 6-year-old who reads above her grade level and has a system. They spent 2 hours. Lily checked out 4 books, which was 2 more than the bag was comfortable holding. He carried it anyway. On the way home, she said, "Oh, are you changing jobs?" He looked down at her. "Where did you hear that?" "Sandra said you might be. She told Mrs. Patterson and I heard." He was quiet for half a block. "I might be. I don't know yet." "Would you still be at the same building?" "Same building." She processed this. "Would you have to wear a different thing?" "Probably." She thought about that for a moment with the seriousness that she brought to things that mattered. "I like your current jacket," she said. "I know," he said. "I'll keep the jacket." She seemed satisfied with this. She reached up and took his hand, and they walked the rest of the way home with the overfull library bag banging against his leg. And he thought about Section 9B and Claude Renard and a board meeting on Monday, and whether any of it was as solid as it felt. And then he stopped thinking about it because Lily was narrating the plot of a book she'd already started and required his full attention for the interesting parts. Sunday night, his phone rang at 9:15. He was doing dishes. He dried his hands on the kitchen towel and looked at the screen. The number had a Belgian country code, but it wasn't the same number as Marchant's. He answered. Mr. Walker, Renard's voice, in English this time. Not Osaka dialect, not any of the languages that had been deployed in that conference room. Just English, clear, and direct. I hope I'm not calling at a bad time. You're calling on a Sunday night, Ethan said. I am, Renard agreed. There was something almost wry in it. I want to be honest with you. The offer from Vasily, the consulting role, that was a tactical move. I think you knew that. I knew that, Ethan said. What I'm calling about now is different. A pause. I've been in this work for 30 years. I've sat across from very good people, trained negotiators, experienced lawyers, specialists with decades of institutional knowledge. What you did in that room last Tuesday was something I have not seen in 30 years. Ethan was quiet. I'm not flattering you, Renard said. Flattery would be a tactical move, and I told you this isn't that. Another pause. I'm calling because I'm going to retire in 18 months, and when I do, there's a function that I perform, for Meridian and for other clients, that will need to go somewhere. I haven't found the right person. Most people in this field develop one skill very well and stop there. You have something different. You're offering me your job, Ethan said. I'm offering you a conversation about it, Renard said. The contract with Blackstone. It will close. The regulatory inquiry will complicate Meridian's position, but not fatally. Our legal team is managing it. A pause. But the relationship between what you have and what any one company can use is limited. You understand that. Ethan looked at the dishes in the rack, the yellow nightlight glow coming from under Lily's door. What you're describing, he said, is being useful to whoever pays the most, without having a side. Most sophisticated professionals in international work operate that way, Renard said, without apology. I know, Ethan said. I'm not criticizing it. I'm just naming it. Renard was quiet for a moment. You have a different preference. I have a daughter, Ethan said, and she's going to grow up and ask me what I did, and I want to be able to answer her. He paused. That's probably not a factor you've had to wait. A longer pause. No, Renard said. It isn't. I appreciate the call, Ethan said. I mean that. I know you do, Renard said, and the line went quiet. Monday morning. The board meeting was at 10. Ethan was in the building at 7, same as always. Floor 31, cart check, spray bottle upright, left wheel cleared of the carpet fiber it had caught on Friday. He worked the East Corridor first, which he always did because the East Corridor had the most foot traffic and needed the most attention in the early hours. At 9:15, Davies appeared at the end of the corridor. That was unusual. Davies didn't come to 31. You should know what she's proposing, Davies said, when he got close enough to talk without projecting. Before the meeting. She told me the outline, Ethan said. The outline, yes, but the full proposal. Davies paused. He was a man who did not have a lot of tells, but he had the look of someone who had spent the weekend reading something and had not entirely finished processing it. She wrote a 12-page case document. Title is Hidden Capital, a framework for identifying and developing non-traditional talent at Blackstone Dynamics. It includes the program you described to her. He paused. It also includes a proposed role and title for you, a compensation structure, and a formal acknowledgement of your contribution to the Meridian negotiation, with the dollar figure attached, as the founding case study. Ethan had stopped moving the mop. She built the whole board case around it, Davies said. Not just around you. Around the idea, the program, the principle. He looked at Ethan steadily. Carver is going to try to kill it. He has a prepared counterargument. I've heard pieces of it secondhand, and it's not nothing. He's going to argue cost, precedent, risk, organizational disruption. What does she need from me? Nothing, Davies said. That's the thing. She's not asking you to do anything. She's just... He stopped. Seemed to be deciding how to say the next part. She went to bat for someone she's known for a week, in front of a board that has been looking for a reason to question her judgment since she took this job. And she did it without asking you to make it easier for her. Ethan looked at him. I'm telling you, Davies said, because I've worked for her for 18 months, and I've seen her be smart, and I've seen her be tough, and I haven't always seen her be that. He straightened slightly, as if he'd said more than he'd intended. The meeting is at 10. Whatever happens, you should know what went into the room this morning. He left. Ethan stood in the corridor for a moment, the mop in his hand, the East Wing quiet and ordinary around him. Then he went back to work. Because the floor needed finishing, and finishing what you started was the only thing he'd ever known for certain was worth doing. At 9:58, 2 floors above him, Vanessa Hale walked into the boardroom with her 12-page document and sat down at the head of the table. And Richard Carver looked at her from across the room with the expression of a man who had already decided how this was going to go. She looked back at him with the expression of a woman who had also already decided. The door closed. The board meeting ran 2 hours and 14 minutes. Ethan knew this because he finished the East Corridor, restocked the supply closet, ran the West Corridor, and was halfway through the server room paper towel check when Angela appeared at the door and said, "Meeting's done," with a face he couldn't read. He looked at her. "Davies wants you upstairs," she said. He put the paper towel roll back in the cart, straightened the spray bottle, took the elevator to 32 shouts. Davies was in the small conference room, not Vanessa's office. He had his jacket off and his sleeves rolled, which Ethan had learned was the version of Davies that emerged after something difficult. There was a legal pad on the table with handwriting covering most of the top page, and a coffee cup that looked like it had been refilled several times. "Sit down," Davies said. Ethan sat. "The vote was 5-3, Davies said. "The program is approved. Your role is approved. Carver, Reyes, and a board member named Fountain voted against. Everyone else voted for." He looked at his notepad. "The approved title is Senior International Strategy Analyst. The compensation structure Vanessa proposed was modified downward by the board. They approved 70% of her original number with a performance review at 6 months that can bring it to the full amount." He looked up. "It's still more than 4 times your current salary." Ethan was quiet. The program, the Hidden Capital Framework, was approved as a 12-month pilot. Vanessa will run it with a small internal team. You're listed as a founding contributor and will have a formal advisory role in identifying candidates. Davies set down his pen. "There are conditions. You'll need to sign an NDA covering the Meridian negotiation details. Your presence at the original session will be documented as an authorized emergency contribution, retroactively cleared. The security breach language is being removed from your file." "Carver accepted all of that?" Ethan said. "Carver accepted the vote," Davies said. "Those are different things." He leaned back slightly. "He made a statement before the vote. I want you to know what he said because you're going to encounter the effects of it in this building for a while. Tell me." He said that the program was a sentimentalized response to an anomalous event. That building organizational policy around a single exceptional case was how companies created costly structural exceptions they couldn't undo. That the correct response to what happened was to close the security gap, not to promote the gap. Davies paused. He was not wrong about everything in that argument. Vanessa's counter was better, but Carver wasn't wrong about everything. Ethan nodded. "Where is she?" "Her office. She asked me to brief you first." Davies gathered his notepad. "She's been in meetings since 7 a.m. She argued for 2 hours in there, and now she has a Meridian call at 3. He stood. "One more thing. The Meridian situation, Marchant's firm in Brussels sent the formal regulatory inquiry documentation this morning. Meridian's legal team has been officially notified. It changes the close timeline." "How much?" "They need the deal closed before the inquiry reaches the discovery phase, which Marchant estimates is 6 to 8 weeks. If we're not signed by then, Meridian may not be in a position to close at all. Their board will freeze major commitments pending the regulatory outcome." Davies looked at him steadily. "That means we have leverage we didn't have last week. The question is how we use it." Ethan thought about Renard's voice on Sunday night. "The contract will close," said with the confidence of a man who'd navigated worse. But there was a difference between navigating worse and navigating it on your own timeline. "They'll push to close fast," Ethan said. "Accept terms that look like the current revised draft. Skip the remaining outstanding points on Section 17 and 21 under time pressure." "Exactly," Davies said, "which is why I need you in the 3 o'clock. Ethan looked at him. "Not maintenance," Davies said. "The other capacity." Tit. Vanessa was at her desk when he knocked on the open door. She looked up, and he saw in her face something that wasn't quite relief. Something closer to the specific tiredness of a person who has been holding a position for a long time and has just been allowed to put it down. "Davies told you," she said. "Yes." He came in. She gestured at the chair across from her desk, and he sat in it, which felt different from every other time he'd sat in a chair in this building. Not better, necessarily. Just different. More honest about what it was. "Thank you," he said. She looked at him. "Don't thank me yet. Carver's going to make the next 6 months uncomfortable." "I know. The compensation is lower than I wanted." "I know that too." He paused. "It's still more than I've made in 3 years." She nodded. There was something in her expression, not pity, nothing like that, more like the specific acknowledgement of a fact that deserves to be acknowledged without being inflated. "The 3 o'clock," she said. "Braun's team is going to want to push for a closed date. Given Marchant's inquiry, they're going to be feeling the pressure even if they don't show it." She turned her monitor slightly so he could see the agenda. "I want you reading the room, not translating. Davies will handle the formal language. But you know how Renard's team communicates, and I need to know when the urgency is real and when it's performed." "Those are different things with Renard," he said. "I know. That's why I need you." The 3 o'clock was different from every other session. Braun was not on the call. That was the first signal. His deputy, a woman named Katrin Sauer, led the Meridian side. Efficient, precise, with a different energy than Braun's measured confidence. Sauer was in a hurry in the way that people are in a hurry when they've been told they're in a hurry by someone above them. Renard was not visible on camera, but halfway through the session, Ethan noticed a shadow at the edge of the frame that moved twice. He was in the room, just off screen. Sauer opened with a revised close timeline, 4 weeks to final signing, which was aggressive given the outstanding points. She framed it as a gesture of commitment, a demonstration of Meridian's seriousness about the partnership. Davies responded with the outstanding points on sections 17 and 21 calmly, specifically, without acknowledging the timeline pressure at all. Sauer pushed. Davies noted the points again. Sauer offered to fold the section 17 discussion into a post-signing appendix, a standard mechanism for deferring minor points until after the main agreement was executed. Ethan leaned toward Vanessa and said low, "Section 17 is not minor. They know that. They're testing whether we know it." She passed a note to Davies. Davies looked at it and said, "Section 17 needs to be resolved in the primary agreement. The compensation structure for early termination by either party isn't something we can defer." Sauer paused. Off camera, the shadow shifted. They went through Section 17 over the next 30 minutes. It was detailed and occasionally tense and ended with revised language that was acceptable. Not perfect, some residual ambiguity in the subclauses that Davies noted for the record, but that weren't structural problems. Section 21 was shorter. Ethan flagged one phrase in Sauer's proposed revision, a German compound word that had a specific meaning in the context of insurance indemnification law that differed from its plain translation. Davies pushed for explicit clarification. Sauer conceded it. At 5:15, with both outstanding sections resolved, Sauer said, "We'd like to propose a signing date, 4 weeks from today." Vanessa looked at Davies. Davies looked at his notes. Ethan looked at the edge of the camera frame where the shadow was. 3 weeks, Vanessa said. Sauer blinked. "Ms. Hale, 4 weeks gives both teams adequate time to—" "3 weeks, Vanessa said again, not aggressively, just clearly. "If the document is clean, and we believe it is pending final legal review, 3 weeks is adequate. 4 weeks adds time neither party benefits from." The silence on the other end of the call was the kind that has content. Then Sauer said, "I'll confirm with our principal. We'll have an answer by tomorrow morning." The answer came at 7:41 the next morning. 3 weeks. Confirmed. Davies forwarded the email to Vanessa with a single line appended. They needed it closed. "We just made it happen on our schedule." Vanessa forwarded it to Ethan. He read it in the facility's locker room, still in his maintenance uniform, before changing for the first day in his new capacity. He sat on the bench for a moment with his phone in his hand. 3 weeks. A signing date. A role with a title and a salary and a performance review in 6 months. a daughter with 4 library books, and opinions about his jacket. None of it felt like the thing he'd expected when he'd knocked on that conference room door 11 days ago. He hadn't expected anything when he knocked, which was maybe the only reason he'd knocked at all. You make different decisions when you're not calculating the outcome. You just do the thing that seems necessary and deal with what comes from it. He put the phone in his locker and changed his clothes. The 3 weeks were not smooth. Carver made his discomfort known through the mechanisms available to him. Questions at the executive level about the Hidden Capital program's cost structure. A request for a formal legal review of Ethan's retroactive authorization for the original session. A quiet conversation with 2 department heads that Marcus reported back to Vanessa in careful, neutral language that she read correctly as a warning. Ethan encountered it directly twice. The first time was in the elevator when a senior VP named Patterson, someone he'd seen on the executive floor for 11 months without exchanging words, stepped in, registered who he was, and looked briefly at the ceiling for the duration of the ride. Not aggressive, just absent in the specific way that people are absent when they've decided someone doesn't warrant acknowledgement. Ethan rode the elevator, got off at his floor, went to his meeting with Davies. The second time was harder. He was in a working session with Davies and 2 members of the legal team when one of the attorneys, a man named Forsyth, mid-40s, good reputation, said something to the other attorney in a voice that was slightly too low, but not low enough. The words were, "This is what happens when we start rewarding people for breaking protocol." Ethan heard it. Davies heard it. Everyone in the room heard it. Davies looked at Forsyth. "The protocol," Davies said, in a voice that was very quiet and very precise, "that was broken resulted in the company avoiding $97 million in liability exposure. If you have a counterproposal for how we should have preferred the alternative, I'd like to hear it. If not, we have 15 pages to review." Forsyth said nothing. They reviewed the 15 pages. Ethan didn't say anything during the exchange and didn't say anything about it afterward. But in the elevator going down that afternoon, Davies said, "That's going to happen again." Not always that openly. "I know," Ethan said. "Does it?" Davies started and seemed to reconsider how he was phrasing it. "How do you handle it? The version of that which doesn't announce itself." Ethan thought about it. "Same way I handled it before," he said. "You do the work. The work is the argument. Everything else is noise." Davies looked at him for a moment. "That's either wisdom or stubbornness." "Probably both," Ethan said. The signing happened on a Wednesday afternoon, 3 weeks and 1 day after the timeline was confirmed. A minor scheduling adjustment on Meridian's end had pushed it by 24 hours, which Vanessa had accepted without renegotiating. The deal was clean, the date was close enough, and she'd learned over this particular process which hills were worth the energy and which weren't. The room was the same main conference room on 32. Same table, same windows, same gray city outside. But the configuration was different. Smaller, quieter. Braun was there in person. Sour. 2 Meridian attorneys. On the Blackstone side, Vanessa, Davies, and 2 members of legal. Ethan was not in the room. He had not been invited, and he had not asked to be. The signing was a formality. The document was done, the language was settled, the work had already happened. Being in the room for signatures would have been theater, and he'd never been comfortable with theater. He was on 31, same as always, running the midday supply check. The building had the particular midday quiet of a Wednesday, most of the executive floor occupied with the kind of sustained work that doesn't make noise. He moved through the east corridor, checked the supply closet, noted that the left wheel on the cart was catching again, and made a mental note to requisition a replacement, even though he wasn't technically in the facility's supply chain anymore. Old habits. His phone buzzed at 2:47. A text from Vanessa. It's signed. He stood in the hallway and read it twice. Then he typed back, "Congratulations." She replied, "Come up when you're done down there." He looked at the cart, looked at the half-finished corridor, finished the corridor, because finishing what you started was the thing, and then took the elevator up. She was in her office with a bottle of sparkling water and 2 glasses, which he found unexpectedly funny. Not champagne, not wine, just sparkling water, because it was 2:50 in the afternoon and she had 2 more meetings, and that was the kind of person she was. $300 million, she said, pouring. Clean terms, he said. Clean terms. She handed him a glass. They touched them together without ceremony. The water was cold and the room was quiet, and outside the windows the city was doing what the city always did, indifferent to the particular victories and losses occurring 32 floors above it. "What happens now, Int?" he said. She sat down. He stayed standing, which he usually did in her office. It was a habit from the early conversations when standing had been the right posture for what he was, and he hadn't fully recalibrated. "The program launches next month," she said. "I need you involved in the identification process, talking to people at different levels of the organization, finding the gaps. The same way you found the mailroom manager and the IT hardware guy." She paused. "I want to start with 12 candidates, people who have something that the organization is sitting on without knowing it." "HR is going to push back on the methodology," he said. "The identification process doesn't fit their standard talent assessment framework." "I know. I'm meeting with the HR director Friday." A pause. "Would you come to that meeting?" He looked at her. "You want me to explain the methodology?" "I want you to explain what it found," she said. "You're the case study. The argument is more convincing coming from inside it than from above it." He thought about Carver's language, sentimentalized response to an anomalous event. He thought about what the counter to that argument actually was. Not a principles argument, not a values argument, but the simple concrete fact that the anomalous event had happened and had produced a result that couldn't be undone, and that the question was whether you learned from it or pretended it was a fluke and waited for the next thing you missed. "I'll be there," he said. Mike. The Hidden Capital pilot launched 6 weeks later with 11 candidates, one fewer than planned, because one person Ethan had identified declined to participate, which was their right and which he respected more than the participation itself. The 11 included the mailroom manager, whose name was Doris Campos. 53. Immigrated from Colombia 21 years ago. Accounting degree from a university in Bogota that the American system hadn't recognized without additional certification she'd never had time or money to pursue. She'd been running the mailroom for 9 years with a level of organizational precision that the financial operations team noticed once they started paying attention, which they hadn't done before because nobody looks at mailroom precision when they're thinking about talent. 3 weeks into the pilot, Doris was doing a rotation in the financial operations department. 6 weeks in, she'd identified a recurring error in the accounts payable reconciliation process that had been generating small discrepancies for 2 years. Not large individually, aggregated across the period, close to $400,000 in unresolved variances that nobody had connected because nobody had been looking at the full picture from her angle. The financial operations director, to his credit, came to Vanessa directly and said, "I need to talk to you about the mailroom." Vanessa said, "I know. Keep going." There were other stories. The IT hardware technician, whose name was Marcus, different Marcus, not her assistant, which created momentary confusion the first time she referenced him in a meeting, had 3 years of self-built financial models that, once reviewed by the strategy team, turned out to include a competitive analysis methodology that the team had been paying an external consultancy $40,000 a year to produce in less detail. None of it was magic. None of it was the dramatic boardroom reversal of the Meridian session. It was slower and quieter and more ordinary, which was exactly what made it real. Talent doesn't usually announce itself through a conference room door. It sits in the mailroom for 9 years. It runs hardware checks on the 28th floor while building models on its own time. It pushes a cart through a hallway at 11 p.m. and hears something through a wall that changes the outcome of a $300 million negotiation. The 6-month review of Ethan's role came in the middle of all of this. Davies ran it, which Vanessa had arranged deliberately. She didn't want to be the one evaluating someone she'd championed, because that was how you created the appearance of a protected outcome. Davies ran it straight, with input from the legal team, the strategy department, and the 3 working sessions Ethan had participated in since the role began. The result was a recommendation for the full compensation structure, approved by the board, 5-3. Same coalition as before, -1. Reyes had moved from against to abstain, which in practice meant 4. Carver voted against and said nothing during the meeting. which Vanessa found more unsettling than his arguments. A man who stops arguing has either accepted the situation or started working on something else. She kept watching. Well, Ethan paid off the debt in month 4. Not all of it at once. It didn't work that way. It never worked cleanly the way you imagined when you were on the other side of it. But the significant portion, the number that had been sitting at the back of his calculations for 3 years, shaping every decision about what he could afford and what he couldn't, that number went to 0 on a Tuesday morning when he transferred the final payment and sat at the kitchen table for a while afterward doing nothing. Lily was at school. The apartment was quiet. The sun was coming through the window at the angle it came through in the morning, and he sat in it and didn't think about very much at all, which was a luxury he'd almost forgotten was available. He called Sandra. "It's done," he said. She knew what he meant. "Oh, Ethan." "Yeah," he said. "How does it feel?" He thought about it honestly, like a thing that was there and now isn't, which is different from how I thought it would feel. "What did you think it would feel like?" "Bigger," he said. "I thought it would feel bigger." "It's going to feel bigger later," she said. "That's how those things work. Right now you're still in the moment of it. Give it a week." She was right. A week later, picking Lily up from school on a Thursday, her dentist appointment had been rescheduled again, which was a minor ongoing negotiation with a 6-year-old who had opinions about dentists. He felt it. She came running out of the building with her backpack swinging and a picture she'd made in art class, already talking before she reached him, and he picked her up mid-sentence, and the weight of her was the same weight it always was, and the feeling was something he didn't have a word for. Relief wasn't right. Gratitude wasn't quite right either. It was simpler than both of those. It was just the feeling of not carrying the other thing anymore, which left room for this. "Dad," she said, slightly muffled against his shoulder, "you're squishing the picture." "Sorry," he said, and didn't put her down for another 10 seconds. The Meridian deal's implementation phase began in month 5. It was unglamorous work, coordination meetings, delivery milestone reviews, the ongoing administrative machinery of a large contract in motion. Ethan was involved at the edges, not the center. His role in implementation was translation support and cultural navigation in the joint working sessions between the Blackstone and Meridian operational teams, which happened monthly and involved the specific friction of 2 organizational cultures trying to execute something they'd agreed to in principle but hadn't yet figured out in practice. He was good at that friction, not at eliminating it, you couldn't eliminate it, but at identifying where it was productive and where it was getting in the way. That distinction turned out to be the most useful thing in the room more often than anyone expected. Claude Renard was not involved in the implementation phase. His name appeared in some of the early coordination documents and then stopped appearing, which Ethan noted without asking about. He got his answer in month 6 in an industry publication that Marcus, the assistant, flagged for him. A brief item. Renard was stepping back from active consulting work, effective immediately rather than at his planned 18-month date. No reason given. The regulatory inquiry in Belgium had moved to a formal investigation phase 2 months prior. The publication noted these facts adjacently without drawing a connection, which was the kind of adjacency that meant something. Ethan read the item twice and then set his phone down and went back to the document he'd been reviewing. He didn't feel triumphant about it. He felt something more complicated, a recognition that the man had been genuinely good at what he did, that there was something that deserved respect in 30 years of skill at anything, and that it was possible to respect a skill and still be glad the person wielding it was no longer pointing it at you. That was about as clean as it got. The evening it happened. The specific evening that Vanessa would think about afterward, when she tried to find the moment that closed the story, she was working late. Not unusually late. She worked late most days. The difference this evening was that most of the executive floor had emptied earlier than usual because of a company social event she'd ducked out of after 40 minutes. The minimum duration that counted as attending, and the floor was quieter than it usually was at 8:30. She was reviewing the program's 6-month report. 11 candidates, now 9 still active. 1 had left the company for personal reasons. 1 had determined the program's path wasn't the right fit, which were both acceptable outcomes. Of the 9 remaining, 6 had moved into expanded roles, 2 were in formal development tracks, and 1, Doris Campos, had just been offered a position as a junior financial analyst with a title and a salary and a performance review at 6 months. The numbers in the report were good, not spectacular. The program was still a pilot, still being figured out in real time, still generating as many questions as answers. But good, solid, the kind of good that was worth something because it wasn't performed. She was reading the section on candidate identification methodology when she noticed the light. Down the hallway, past 2 empty offices and the glass-walled conference room that was dark, there was a third office that was not dark. The door was slightly open. A desk lamp was on. She'd given Ethan that office at the start of the role, small, interior-facing, next to a storage room that nobody had successfully repurposed since the filing system went digital. Not a prestigious location, but it had a door that closed and a surface to work on, which was what he'd asked for. She hadn't expected him to be there this late. She walked down the hallway, stopped in the doorway. He was at his desk with a notebook open, the handwritten kind, physical, the way he did his best thinking. And on the desk beside it, a language learning application open on his tablet. The audio was playing through one earbud. The other earbud was out. He was writing something in the notebook while listening, which was his method, the way he'd told her he retained things. Hear it, write it, use it in a sentence, hear it again. The language on the tablet, from the few words she caught before she said anything, sounded like Portuguese. Brazilian variant, probably, based on the rhythm. She stood in the doorway for a moment without speaking. He noticed her. She wasn't being particularly quiet, and took the earbud out. "Still here?" he said. "Same question," she said. He looked at the tablet. "Portuguese. We have 2 implementation partners in Sao Paulo coming in next quarter. The operational working sessions are going to hit the same register problem the Meridian session did if nobody in the room can track informal communication. You're learning Portuguese for a meeting that's 4 months away. It takes time to get the register right," he said. "You can't cram the register." She leaned against the doorframe. The hallway behind her was empty and quiet, the city doing its late evening thing outside the windows at the end of the hall. Lights, movement, the perpetual background of a place that didn't really stop. "How many will that be?" she asked. He considered. 9, if you count Moroccan Arabic separately from Gulf Arabic, which I do. 9 languages. He'd been at 8 when she first asked. In the time since, in the middle of a new role, the implementation work, the program development, a 6-year-old with library opinions, he'd started on a 9th. She thought about what she'd written on that notepad the first night. How do you lose something you never knew you had? She'd been thinking about Ethan when she wrote it, about how close the company had come to never knowing he existed, about how many times he'd pushed that cart through the building without anyone in a position to make a different decision ever stopping to wonder what was pushing it. But standing in the doorway watching him with his notebook and his earbud and the quiet, focused energy of someone doing something for its own sake, not for the review in 6 months, not for the board, not for the $300 million deal that was already history, she understood that the question she'd been asking was the wrong question. You don't lose what you never knew you had. You just never look. The looking was the whole thing. The looking was the decision you made or didn't make every time someone you didn't expect to matter passed through a room where you had the authority and the comfort level to look past them. Carver wasn't wrong that it was easier not to look. Easier and tidier and more consistent with a world that had assigned everyone to the roles it felt they deserved and didn't want to be bothered renegotiating. The problem was that the world was wrong about what people deserved, with a frequency that should have been humbling and mostly wasn't, because the people who suffered from that wrongness were usually not in the rooms where the decisions got made. She thought about Doris Campos running the mailroom for 9 years. She thought about $400,000 sitting in a reconciliation error because nobody had looked. She thought about Ethan in this hallway 11 days into her crisis, hand on a cleaning cart, knowing something that 20 specialists didn't know, standing at the edge of a room he wasn't supposed to enter. She had almost not let him in. She needed to remember that. Not as guilt. Guilt was useless, but as information. She had almost not let him in, and the version of herself that almost didn't was the default version, the one that existed without conscious decision. The different version, the one that said a chair and meant it, was a choice. It required choosing every time. That was the thing worth keeping. You should go home, she said. He looked at the notebook, then at the tablet. 30 more minutes. You always say that. It's usually accurate, he said. She pushed off the doorframe. How's Lily? He smiled, which was a thing she'd seen maybe 4 times in 2 months, and which still had the quality of something slightly surprising, like weather that wasn't in the forecast. She finished all 4 library books. She started rating them. Rating them how? Stars. She made a chart. He paused. She gave the one I recommended 2 stars. Which one did you recommend? One about a kid who learns to sail. I thought she'd like it. What was wrong with it? According to Lily, the main character made too many mistakes. He said it with the specific tone of a person who finds something both funny and slightly personal. She prefers characters who figure things out faster. Vanessa laughed. A real one, not the managed version she used in meetings. She sounds like someone I know. He looked at her. She's better at it, he said. She's 6 and she already knows what she's good at. I didn't figure that out until considerably later. When did you figure it out? He thought about it. The desk lamp made the small office warm in particular, the kind of light that belongs to late evenings and genuine conversation. In a hallway, he said, about 2 months ago. She held his gaze for a moment. Not dramatically, just the length of time it took for the honesty in the answer to land and settle. Good night, Ethan, she said. Good night, Ms. Hale, he said, and put the earbud back in. She walked down the hallway toward the elevator, past the empty offices and the dark conference room, and she was smiling in the specific way that happens when something has ended correctly. Not perfectly, because nothing ends perfectly, but correctly, which is the thing that actually matters and is much harder to achieve. Behind her in the small interior-facing office, Ethan Walker opened his notebook to a fresh page and wrote a sentence in Portuguese and then said it quietly to himself, listening to the way it sat in his mouth, whether it felt borrowed or whether it was starting to feel real. It was starting to feel real. That was how it always worked. You borrowed the language until the language became yours, until the words stopped being foreign and started being something you thought in, dreamed in, used without noticing that you were using them. It wasn't talent, it wasn't a gift. It was the particular stubborn willingness to stay in the room with something until it opened up, to resist the pull toward what was already comfortable, to keep going past the point where most people decided they'd learned enough. He'd learned that lesson young, in the specific way that lessons learned young become structural. They don't just inform your decisions, they become the shape your decisions take. His father had been a man who fixed things, who treated every broken thing as a puzzle and every puzzle as worth his full attention. He died when Ethan was 19, before Ethan had understood what that posture actually was. He'd just thought his father liked fixing things. He understood now that it was something else. The refusal to accept that broken was a permanent state. Everything broken had a solution if you were patient enough and honest enough about the actual problem. He'd applied that to cargo manifests in Liège and engine blocks in Stuttgart and rice harvest logistics in rural Japan, and eventually to a contract that was trying to become something it wasn't while 20 experts watched it happen and couldn't see it. He wasn't extraordinary. He needed to be clear with himself about that, because the version of the story that made him extraordinary was the version that missed the point. He'd been in the hallway at the right moment. He'd known things that happened to be necessary at the right moment. He'd knocked on a door because it seemed necessary, and a woman on the other side of it had made a decision that most people in her position wouldn't have made, and that decision had mattered in ways that neither of them had fully predicted. Those were the actual facts. The rest of it, the program, the role, the salary, the debt that was now 0, the Portuguese he was learning in a small office at 8:30 in the evening, was what happened when the facts were handled honestly instead of tidied into a story that fit better. He wrote another sentence, said it again. The accent was still off. He could hear the places where his mouth defaulted to cadences from other languages, the muscle memory of 8 other ways of making sound. That was the work, finding where you were defaulting to what you already knew and pushing past it into what was actually there. Same work as everything else, slower than he'd like and necessary. He turned the page and started again. Just The $300 million contract ran its first year without a major incident. There were smaller ones. A delivery timeline that slipped 6 weeks because of a port closure in Rotterdam, a subsidiary compliance question in the Belgian market that required 3 rounds of clarification and 1 strongly worded letter from Davies before it was resolved, a personnel change on the Meridian side that briefly disrupted the working relationship at the operational level. None of these were crises. They were the ordinary friction of a large agreement between 2 organizations that were still learning how to work together, and they were handled the way ordinary friction gets handled when the agreement underneath is sound, with work and time and the willingness to stay at the table. Ethan was at the table for some of it and not others. He learned where his presence mattered and where it didn't, which took longer than he expected and required more mistakes than he wanted. He got a clause wrong once, a translation judgment call in a working session that he was confident about and shouldn't have been, that cost an afternoon of backtracking and an apology that he gave directly, without elaboration, to the person it affected. She accepted it. He filed it in the category of things that happened when you were doing real work and moved on. The Hidden Capital program, at 12 months, had identified 31 candidates across the organization. 18 were in some form of expanded role or formal development track. Doris Campos was 2 months into her junior analyst position and had already found 2 more reconciliation anomalies, smaller than the first but real. The board approved a second year of the program at the annual review. Carver voted against, with a written objection attached to the record. The objection was specific and detailed and not entirely wrong, and Vanessa kept a copy of it on her desk as a reminder that the people who were wrong about you were often right about something. The thing about Carver was that he genuinely believed what he said. He wasn't corrupt, wasn't self-interested in the simple way that made it easy to dismiss him. He believed in order, in protocol, in the established categories that assigned people their place and kept things predictable. He was wrong about what that cost. But he wasn't wrong that the cost of disrupting it was also real, that every exception created a question, that you couldn't build an organization entirely on the principle of looking past its own structure. What he couldn't see, what his version of order didn't have room for, was that the structure had already been making a different kind of exception for years. It had been accepting Doris Campos from the accounting work she could do. It had been accepting Ethan Walker from every room where his actual value was relevant. The exception wasn't the program. The program was the correction. Vanessa tried explaining this to him once at a board dinner, in the specific way you explain things to people you don't expect to convince but want to be honest with anyway. He listened. He said, "I understand the argument. I think the risk is different from how you're calculating it." They had a glass of wine and moved on, and the next board meeting was the same as the one before it, and that was probably how it was going to be for a while. She could live with that. On a Friday evening in the 13th month, Ethan picked up Lily from school and they went to the library. Different library this time, farther away, because Lily had decided the closer one's selection in her preferred section was inadequate, which was a judgment she'd arrived at through a process he didn't fully understand but respected on principle. She checked out 3 books and rated the selection a 4 out of 5, which was high for a first visit. On the bus home, she said, "Dad, what's your job now?" He looked at her. He'd explained it before, several times, in several different ways. But she had a habit of asking questions she already knew the answer to as a way of checking whether the answer was still the same. "I help make sure people understand each other," he said, "when they're working together and speaking different languages." "What kind of languages?" "All kinds. Words, and also the way people mean things, which isn't always the same as what they say." She thought about this with the seriousness she gave things that interested her. "That's like being a translator." "Kind of. But more?" "A little more," he said. She accepted this, looked out the window at the city going by. "Can I learn a language?" she said. "Which one?" She thought about it. "All of them," she said, "but one first." He looked at her. This small person with her library books and her 4 out of 5 ratings and her gap-toothed seriousness, and felt something that he'd learned in the past year to not try to name too precisely. It was too large for the words available, and it was fine that way. "We'll start with 1, he said, "and see where it goes." "Okay," she said, and opened the first book. The city moved around them, indifferent and enormous, full of rooms that Ethan Walker hadn't yet walked into, and languages that hadn't yet become his, and work that was still ahead in a shape he couldn't fully see. That was all right. He'd never needed to see the whole shape. He just needed to do the next thing. Knock on the next door, learn the next word, show up to the next shift with his hands ready and his attention on the actual problem. The rest had a way of following from that, if you were honest about the work and patient about the outcome, and stubborn enough not to stop in the hallway when the room needed you to come inside. Some people spent their whole lives being told what they were worth by the rooms they'd been put in. A few of them knocked anyway. That was the whole story.